The Labor Movement in the United States. Volume 5. The AFL in the Progressive Era, 1910 to 1915. By Philip S. Foner. Copyright. Contents. Preface 1. The McNamara Case. Background in the L.A. Times Explosion. 7. The Arrests and the Defense Campaign. 11. McNamara Confessions and the Aftermath. 22. 2. Labor and the Progressive Movement. I. The Muckrakers. 32. The System. 38. The Progressive Program. 38. Labor and Direct Legislation. 41. Labor and the Recca J.I. 48. 3. Labor and the Progressive Movement. 2. Labor and Municipal Reform. 56. Labor and Reform in Toledo. 63. Labor and Reform in Cleveland. 66. Labor and Municipal Ownership. Chicago. 74. Labor and Municipal Ownership. New York. 78. Labor and Municipal Ownership. Conclusion. 83. Labor's Progressive Program. 84. AFL Leadership and the Progressive Movement. 88. 4. The Political Policies and Practices of the AFL. 1910 to 1912. Progressives in Congress. 91. Sentiment for Independent Political Action. 93. The Election of 1910. 95. Labor Victories. 97. The National Conventions of 1912. 101. The 1912 Campaign. 111. 37325691. 5. The Fruits of Victory. 119. Beginning of the Wilson Administration. 119. No Relief from the Sherman Act. 122. The 1913 AFL Convention. 127. The AFL and Social Legislation. 128. The Clayton Act. 130. What did labor gain? 139. 6. The General Strike in PHILADEL PHIA 1910-143. The Streetcar Strike. 143. The General Strike. 151. End of the Strikes. 157. 7. The Shopmen's Strike on the Harriman System. 1911-1915-164. Background and Causes of the Strike. 164. The Harriman System Strike. 170. End of the Strike. 180. 8. Revolt of the Miners. West Virginia. 1912-1913-182. The Strike. 185. End of the Strike. 1905. 9. Revolt of the Miners. Colorado. 1913-1914-196. The Strike and the Ludlow Massacre. 200. End of the Strike. 211. 10. Revolt of the Michigan Copper Miners. 1913-214. The Strike. 216. End of the Strike. 224. 11. Revolt of the Garment Workers. I. Uprising of the Waste Makers. 226. The Strike. 228. End of the Strike. 239. 12. Revolt of the Garment Workers. 2. Repercussions. 241. New York Cloak Makers Strike. 241. Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. 246. New York Fur Workers Strike. 251. White Goods and Men's Clothing Strikes. 256. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. 260. Reference Notes. 265. Index 284. History of the Labor Movement in the United Street Atesh. Volume 5. Preface. In 1910, the American Federation of Labor was 29 years old. It had already established the fact that it was the first truly stable national labor federation in U.S. history. Every attempt at national federation prior to the founding of the AFL had failed to achieve longevity. Only the American Federation of Labor had survived, and while not coextensive with all unionization in the United States, it represented the vast majority of organized workers. By 1912, 2,483,500 American wage earners were organized, 1,843,158 of whom were members of the AFL. Total membership of the AFL's affiliated unions in 1912 was 74% of all unionized workers. But in only two industries, liquor distilling and brewing, did the union membership rise to more than 40% of the total workforce. In the skilled trades, not more than 15 or 20% of the workers belonged to labor organizations. Less than 10% of the predominantly unskilled labor force in steel, oil, chemicals, and other mass production industries were organized. Clearly, the AFL represented only a small minority of the labor force. In the third volume of my multi-volume history of the labor movement in the United States, The Policies and Practices of the American Federation of Labor, 1900 to 1909, I sought to account for the unorganized status of the vast majority of American workers. To a major extent, it was due to the determined opposition of employers to unionism. However, added to this, were the policies adopted by the AFL, class collaboration, exemplified by participation in the leadership and framing of policies of the National Civic Federation, concentration on organizing the skilled workers, and clinging to the craft union structure long after it was largely outmoded as a form in unionizing the mass production industries. The exclusion of blacks, women and foreign-born workers from most of the craft unions, and the acceptance of a racist approach toward blacks, Chinese and Japanese workers, and those from Eastern Europe. Despite the presence in the AFL of such industrial unions as the United Mine Workers and the Brewers, the Federation was dominated by craft unionism. Even the alternative proposal to industrial unionism, the creation of voluntary industrial departments, such as the Building Trades Department, fell far short of the mark, and failed to eliminate jurisdictional conflicts. In short, while the AFL membership climbed in the years from 1900 to 1909, it failed to meet the challenge posed by the rise of modern mass production industries, in which the unskilled and semi-skilled, blacks, women and recent immigrants were the majority of the workers. Meanwhile, as was demonstrated in the fourth volume, the Industrial Workers of the World, 1905 to 1917, FEL, WW was attempting to meet this challenge. By basing itself on industrial unionism and welcoming into its ranks all workers regardless of race, sex, creed, color, nationality or skill, the Wobblies made an enormous appeal to precisely those workers neglected by the AFL. The present volume covers the history of the American Federation of Labor and many of its affiliates in the second decade of the 20th century. In discussing labor and progressivism, it has, however, been necessary to trace the origins before this period. But the concentration is on an era of great labor militancy, an era which produced a transformation of workers' consciousness in America. The focus in the present volume is not on inchoate dissatisfaction but on organized resistance, on workers who belong to trade unions, and on their commitment to organize the unorganized, and the struggle for change in their lives. Through these struggles, the organized workers forged a link with large sections of the working class, and made it clear that the U.S. ruling class had failed to extend completely its hegemony over the working class. The volume demonstrates that the class collaboration promoted by the National Civic Federation and the foremost leaders of the AFL on a national level failed to diffuse the class struggles on the local levels. This work could not have been completed without the generous assistance of numerous libraries and historical societies. I am indebted to the American Federation of Labor for permission to use the incoming correspondence of the AFL and the letterbooks of Samuel Gompers. I wish to thank Dorothy Swanson and her staff at the Tamiment Institute, Elmer Bobst Library, New York University for kind assistance and cooperation, and the staffs of the Chicago Historical Society, Columbia University Library, Boston Public Library, Harvard University Library, Howard University Library, Library of Congress, New York Public Library, Bancroft Library, University of California, Berkeley, University of California, Los Angeles Library, University of Pennsylvania Library, Yale University Library, Kansas Historical Society, University of Wisconsin Library, State Historical Society of Wisconsin, Library of the U.S. Department of Labor, New York State Library, Detroit Public Library, Cleveland Public Library, Labadie Collection, University of Michigan Library, University of Maine, Farmington Library, Library Company of Philadelphia, Free Library of Philadelphia, Radcliffe College Library, Michigan Technological University Library, University of Alabama Library, Wayne State University Library, University of Chicago Library, Indiana University Library, University of Illinois Library, University of Maryland Library, and the National Archives. I also wish to thank the members of the library staff of the Langston Hughes Memorial Library, Lincoln University, Pennsylvania for cooperation and for assistance in obtaining materials through interlibrary loan from libraries, historical societies, and other institutions. Finally, I wish to thank my brother, Henry Foner, who read the manuscript and made useful suggestions. Philip S. Foner. Chapter 1. The McNamara Case. On October 1, 1910, an explosion destroyed a printing plant of the Los Angeles Times, killing 21 Times employees. During April 1911, following detective work coordinated by William J. Burns, the brothers John J. and James B. McNamara were arrested, accused of dynamiting the Times building, and indicted for murder. The enemies of labor seized upon the fact that J. McNamara was secretary-treasurer of a major trade union, the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers, BSIW, and that J. B. McNamara was a trade unionist, to use the case for a general accusation that the labor movement resorted to murder in order to realize its aims. The crime of the century, as the bombing incident was called, was a cause célèbre in American labor history and had significant repercussions in the entire area of labor-capital relations. The McNamara case is discussed at some length in work by Lewis Adamick, Grace Hillman Stimson, and Graham Adams Jr., but labor historians have paid relatively scant attention to it. It is either ignored, dismissed as just another example of labor violence, or treated as an interesting but isolated episode. Point 2. The story of the McNamara case begins with the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers. By 1910, that union had gone through several years of bitter battle against a coalition of open-shop forces. Included among them was the National Erectors Association, founded on March 3, 1903, and a leading member of that association was the American Bridge Company, a subsidiary unit of the giant United States Steel Corporation. From its inception in April 1901, U.S. Steel instituted a systematic procedure aimed at driving out of existence every labor organization of workmen in its various plants. By 1910, it had succeeded in virtually destroying the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, as well as the unions of the carpenters, molders, machinists, bricklayers, masons, seamen, and longshoremen. In fact, all the organizations of workmen either in the plants it originally held or those it took over after its organization. With unionism in its plants all but defunct, U.S. Steel had proceeded to force down wages, lengthen the hours of work, and establish whatever working conditions it wished. The only remaining militant labor organization that still resisted the giant corporation's encroachments was the Bridge and Structural Iron Workers Union. Point 3. With the support of U.S. Steel, the American Bridge Company refused to allow the union to do any erecting work within company property. Early in 1906, the union responded with a strike, which lasted for almost a decade and produced some of the most brutal tactics ever used in a struggle between capital and labor. Point 4. Shortly after the strike began, the National Erectors Association entered the contest against the union, with the aim of completely destroying it and instituting the open shop. The association hired Walter Drew, one of the nation's leading exponents of the open shop, to carry out its plan to destroy the Ironworkers Union. It sent spies into the union, employed detective agencies to disrupt union activity, and stood ready to lend its whole power and influence to the open shop cause in any of the other building trades. 5. Standard accounts of the McNamara case emphasize that the union had decided that any chances of success against the open shop drive of the National Erectors Association were doomed to fail if it employed only the ordinary union methods. Hence, according to this view, within a year after the strike against the American Bridge Company began, the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers launched a campaign of dynamiting, and from 1906 to 1911, union leaders were responsible for some 110 explosions. The damage done, on the whole, was not very great, usually less than several $1,000s, and it has therefore been assumed that the intent was not to destroy building projects entirely, but rather to force employers to grant union demands in order to forestall greater destruction in the future. 6. The scene now shifts to Los Angeles, where a determined campaign was being waged for the extinction of the labor movement. Led by Harrison Gray Otis, publisher of the Los Angeles Times, and the Merchants and Manufacturers Association, M&M, it aimed to convert Los Angeles into what one trade unionist described as a city of slave owners, slave drivers, and chattel slaves. 7. Under Otis, the Los Angeles Times, with its tremendous circulation, became the spearhead of a 20-year campaign against organized labor. It fully earned its reputation as the most unfair, unscrupulous and malignant enemy of organized labor in America. By 1910, Los Angeles was being described as Otistown of the open shop. B. Having fought off unionization, the Los Angeles employers were able to compete successfully with industries that had long been established in San Francisco, one of the most tightly organized union towns in the country. The employers there informed the labor leaders that unless the workers in Los Angeles were unionized, the San Francisco industrialists would either have to establish open shop conditions or go out of business. It was precisely at this time that Los Angeles labor decided to launch a new campaign to unionize the city. The San Francisco unions voted to take immediate steps to aid their sister unions in Los Angeles, and a decisive effort to organize the open shop city was begun. 9. On one side were ranged the M&M, the Chamber of Commerce, and the National Association of Manufacturers, with Harrison Gray Otis Times as the coordinator and publicist of the Open Shop Alliance. On the other side were the Los Angeles unions, supported by the militant unions of San Francisco, the AFL, the International Molders Union, and the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers. The union allies decided that the strongest point of attack would be through the Iron Workers Union, which was among the few well-organized unions in the city. In addition, the Founders and Employers Association had just rejected the union's demands, a minimum wage of $4 for an 8-hour day and extra pay for overtime. On June 1, 1910, the metal workers struck, and by the 10th, 1,500 of them had abandoned their jobs. The M&M pledged both money and moral support to the employers, and by the end of June it had collected $350,000 to smash the strike. Unions throughout California voted to assess themselves enough to be able to send from $8,000 to $9,000 weekly to Los Angeles. Although the Unionists had refrained from violence, Los Angeles Mayor Alexander announced that the police would act against any pickets who blocked the streets illegally, and the Superior Court issued a series of injunctions against the strikers which, if obeyed, would have crippled any action the workers might have taken. On June 22, 1910, in an editorial entitled, Common Peril, the Los Angeles Times declared, "These are days of common peril in Los Angeles. A foreign foe is at the gates and threatens all alike. The call comes to drop all little disputes and devote all attention to the enemy." On July 16, an anti-picketing ordinance was enacted by unanimous vote of the Good Government Council. It prohibited loitering, picketing, carrying or displaying banners, signs, or transparencies, or speaking in public streets in a loud or unusual tone for certain purposes. The penalty was 50 days in jail or a fine of $100, or both. 2. The union members kept right on picketing and the police arrested them by the score, eventually booking 472 people. But few strikers deserted, and the passage of the anti-picketing ordinance without a dissenting vote only served to reawaken labor's interest in politics. A boycott of scab beer was begun when the brewers rejected demands for increased wages for the bottlers and drivers, who were the lowest paid workers on the West Coast. It was so successful that by September, the brewers were ready to sign. In the first 9 months of 1910, the Central Labor Council grew from 62 unions with 6,000 members to 85 unions with 9,500 members. 2,500 unaffiliated union men brought labor's strength to 12,000.12 on September 23. After 5 days in Los Angeles, James Wilson, president of the Pattern Makers League of North America, reported to the AFL Metal Trad S Department, "There is a determination on the part of the men that speaks well for the success of the movement that we are now engaged in this city. It is on wide time when victory will be achieved. 13. Then, on October 1, 1910, the Los Angeles Times building was destroyed by an explosion and resulting fire which left 21 dead. The next morning, the Times, printed in an auxiliary plant, flashed the provocative headline, "Unionist bombs wreck the Times." Upon learning of the incident, Otis had immediately concluded that the labor unions were responsible, and he brought to bear all his talent for inflammatory journalism. The publisher editorialized, "Zero, you anarchist scum, you cowardly murderers, you leeches upon honest labor, you midnight assassins, you whose hands are dripping with the innocent blood of your victims, you against whom the wails of poor widows and the cries of fatherless children are ascending to the great white throne. Go mingle with the crowd on the street corners, look upon the crumbled and blackened walls, look at the ruins wherein are buried the calcined remains of those whom you murdered." 14. A wave of hysteria swept through Los Angeles as unexploded bombs were discovered near the homes of H. G. Otis and F. J. Zehandler, leader of the M&M. Several sticks of dynamite were also found near the Alexander Hotel Annex and the Hall of Records, then in the process of construction by the anti-union Llewellyn Iron Works. On Christmas Day, the Llewellyn factory itself was partially wrecked by an explosion. All this kept the city in a state of excitement and terror, and the employers sought to use the hysteria to defeat the continuing metal trades strike. 15. But George Gunry, Secretary-Treasurer of the Strike Committee, kept assuring AFL headquarters in Washington that, "We are still making progress and moving along to our ultimate success." The committee, he reported, had met with Mayor Alexander, who urged that the strike be called off, as the merchants and manufacturers would never give in. "We told him," Gunry wrote, "that as far as we were concerned the strike was just started and that we had no power to call it off, as that was up to the men and it was as much as our lives were worth to ask them to call it off." The mayor then mentioned the explosion, and evidently hinted that it was connected with the strike, but the committee assured him that we were ready at all times to aid the authorities in any investigation they might make, and we also were open for investigation. 16. The investigation was already underway. With the posting of sizable rewards for the discovery of the perpetrators of the Times explosion, a nationwide hunt had begun. The M&M, the Chamber of Commerce, and the municipal authorities each hired detective agencies to track down the dynamiters. The city employed William J. Burns, a notorious anti-labor detective, who was already investigating a wave of dynamitings which had, since 1906, smashed machines, bridges, building frames, and supplies in more than 100 explosions throughout the country as part of the ongoing war between the Bridge and Structural Iron Workers and the Erectors Association. Burns told Mayor Alexander that his evidence had convinced him that the Times bombing was the latest incident in this war and was planned, as were all the others, at the Union's international headquarters in Indianapolis. 17. Burns soon identified the Union's chief dynamiters as James B. McNamara and Orty McMoney Gall. He insisted that McNamara was the asterisk, although it is generally noted in histories of the McNamara case that Burns was engaged by the city of Los Angeles. Louis Adamic claims that he was hired by the National Erectors Association. My America, New York, 1942, page 31. Man who had wrecked the Times building and that McManigal had set the dynamite at the Llewellyn plant. He charged further that they had received their orders and payment from John J. McNamara, Secretary-Treasurer of the BSIW, and from H. S. Hawkins, who was on his payroll. Burns' operatives trailed J. B. McNamara and McManigal to Detroit, where they were suspected of planning to destroy the new 2 Million Railroad station. On April 14, 1911, Burns' son, Raymond, along with police officers from both Detroit and Chicago, arrested the suspects. Dynamite, percussion caps, and alarm clocks were found in their valises. Upon being told that they were wanted for a recent bank robbery in Chicago, for which they had valid alibis, the prisoners waived extradition and voluntarily accompanied their captors to Chicago. On the train, McNamara began to suspect that he had been arrested in connection with the Times explosion, and, according to Burns, he futilely offered his captors $30,000 for an opportunity to escape. In Chicago, in a proceeding that was only quasi-legal at best, the prisoners, instead of being booked and jailed, were taken to the home of Chicago Police Sergeant William H. Reed for questioning and held in private captivity. 18. Burns was certain he could persuade McManigal to confess by convincing him that the detective knew everything and that the Union would, in the end, let McManigal take the blame for the Times disaster and die. Burns later revealed that this strategy enabled him to get McManigal to tell everything he knew and to promise to help the prosecution to the limit of his ability. 19 Beginning on April 13 and continuing until the following morning, McManigal gave an amazingly detailed account of his career as a dynamiter. His statements implicated John McNamara, Frank Ryan, president of the BSIW, H.S. Hawken, and other union leaders in a dynamite conspiracy against the National Erectors Association. According to McManigal's signed confession, it was J.B. McNamara who actually placed the bomb in the Times building on his brother's instructions. 20. With McManigal's confession in his hands, Burns was ready to proceed against J. McNamara. As soon as he had reached Chicago, Burns had telegraphed Los Angeles for extradition papers and for policemen to serve them. When they arrived, he went to Indianapolis and obtained a warrant for J. McNamara's arrest from the governor of Indiana. Walter Reed of the Erectors Association seems to have been helpful in this project. Burns and two detectives then went to the BSIW office, where they arrested J. McNamara in the midst of an executive board meeting and charged him with murder in connection with the Times bombing and with implication in the Llewellyn bombing. McNamara was immediately rushed to police court where he was arraigned before Judge James A. Collins, who denied McNamara's request for a lawyer and released him, instead, to the Los Angeles police for extradition. Within half an hour after his arrest, McNamara found himself in an automobile heading for Los Angeles. On the afternoon of the same day, April 22, James B. McNamara and McManigal were turned over to two Los Angeles police officers. On the 26th, the three men entered jail in Los Angeles. 21. The day after the arrest of J. McNamara, the Los Angeles Times ran a headline reading, "The Dynamiters of the Times Building Caught. Crime Traced Directly to High Union Labor." Officials. 22 Obviously, for Otis, the case had been tried and decided before the trial began. J. McNamara had been arraigned in a police court, which did not have jurisdiction in extradition cases. He had been refused the right to consult a lawyer, had been subjected to extradition proceedings even though he was not a fugitive from justice, and had been conveyed out of the state by automobile. The fact that Burns had subverted due process did not trouble the Los Angeles Times, or most of the rest of the nation's press. But it did make the whole procedure look like kidnapping. Moreover, it was this act, together with the fact that a third man, McManigal, had confessed and implicated the McNamaras, that caused so many people to believe that this was another frame-up. It was too reminiscent of the Haywood-Moyer-Pettibone case, a few years earlier, in the aftermath of the murder of the ex-governor of Idaho. These men had also been abducted from Colorado to stand trial on the basis of the confession of an informer named Harry Orchard. In that case, Clarence Darrow had successfully defended the accused and had completely exposed the frame-up. Here, too, there was a kidnapping and an informer, all the earmarks of another frame-up. The AFL pointed out that the unlawful and un-American kidnapping of McNamara formed one of the chief factors of fixing in the minds of working people of our country that he was innocent. The labor movement feared, with justification, that the illegal removal of the McNamaras would set a precedent that could be used for the Haywood-Pettibone Mayer case. See Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement in the United States, Volume IV, New York, 1965, pp. 40-59. Extensively in the future. The McNamara case was thus tainted by this virtual kidnapping, and many people quickly concluded that a prosecution and a detective agency capable of such reckless action was also capable of fabricating the entire case. 24. The fact that the MCN Amaras asserted their innocence and that J. was a distinguished union official with a reputation for integrity, only served to strengthen the belief that Burns had manufactured the evidence against them. That I am innocent of any infraction of the law in word or deed needs no emphasis from me, for the truth is mighty and will prevail right speedily. J.J. McNamara wrote to Gompers, and for it I shall be content to wait. During a visit by the AFL president to the brothers in the Los Angeles jail, J. McNamara again asserted his innocence. The brothers seemed determined to plead innocent and to take their chances in a prolonged legal fight. 25. For his part, Gompers testified from his personal knowledge of the man that John J. McNamara was a painstaking, conscientious, and efficient official, conservative and thoroughly in sympathy with the higher aims of organized labor. And the executive officers of 8 other international unions with headquarters in Indianapolis added. We know John J. McNamara. He is an industrious, reliable, painstaking and courteous gentleman. He is a graduate of an Indianapolis law school, thus making manifest his ambition to tread the paths that lead to higher planes of activity. In every way so far as we know he is a model citizen. 26. The background of the case also served to strengthen the argument that the MCN Amaras were victims of a frame-up. Centrally involved was the publisher of the Los Angeles Times, Harrison Gray Otis, whose hatred of the labor movement was intense and who, it was generally believed in labor circles, would not stop at any limits in his effort to destroy the trade unions. It was not surprising, then, that many in the labor and liberal movements saw the case as a product of Otis' anti-labor prejudice. Some of them even charged that Otis himself had ordered the destruction of the Times building. Others held him indirectly responsible, arguing that the building's destruction had actually been caused by a leaky gas jet, and that the time bomb was apparently designed to do minimum damage to the property, but had been accidentally placed near the organizations were the International Typographical Union, the bricklayers, masons and plasterers, the United Mine Workers, the journeyman barbers, the teamsters, the bookbinders, the carpenters and joiners, and the locomotive firemen and engine men. The leaking gas. Witnesses were said to be ready to prove that the gas odor had been so bad that some employees had been forced to leave the plant the night of the explosion. 27. Then, of course, the Erectors Association, the American Bridge Company, and U.S. Steel had their own reasons for encouraging the prosecution of the McNamaras and their elimination from the labor scene. 28. There was also an important political factor involved in the prosecution of the labor leaders. The McNamara case was being fought against the background of the 1911 Los Angeles mayoralty campaign, which was reaching its climax at the same time. The metal trade strike had aroused the political consciousness of Los Angeles labor. The political end of the situation is being given a great deal of attention. Gunry wrote to AFL Secretary-Treasurer Frank Morrison on February 10, 1911. We feel reasonably sure that by coupling the labor union party with the Socialist Party, also coupling the Afro-American League of this city, which had already joined hands with us, and with what recruits we can gain from the unskilled laborers by organizing them into the Unskilled Labor Organization, I think we can win the city of Los Angeles at the coming municipal election. 29. By the time the McNamara trial began, it appeared likely that the socialist candidate, Job Harriman, was headed for victory. With the threat of a socialist victory in Los Angeles, it was reasonable to assume that the McNamara case had been manufactured in order to intimidate the moderate, middle-class voters into rejecting the socialists. 30. Finally, additional grave doubt was cast on the entire procedure by the repeated strong hints by Burns that many prominent AFL leaders, including Gompers, were implicated in the dynamiting. The whole affair smacks of well-laid prearrangement, to strike at the men having the confidence of the working people, Gompers declared. And he wrote John Mitchell of the United Mine Workers on January 5, 1911. The information which has come to me from Los Angeles is to the asterisk on January 5, 1911, Gunry wrote to Morrison. We are in touch with the leadership of the Afro-American League, an organization that practically includes all the colored people in Los Angeles. We held a joint committee meeting and formed a temporary organization. We believe this is a move in the right direction, and it is up to organized labor to support the colored wage earner, and when he once realizes that, he will be with us politically and otherwise. This organization of colored people has been used in this city from time to time, as a strikebreaker, and they are getting tired of the game, and now believe that their lot should be cast with us. They also hold the balance of power politically in this city. Geo. Gunry to Frank Morrison, Los Angeles, January 12, 1911, AFL. Core. Effect that a great conspiracy has been and is still afoot to fasten upon the Union workmen any and all crimes which may be committed in Los Angeles. 31. When all this is taken into account, it is not surprising that when the McNamaras were indicted, the national labor leadership asserted their innocence. I have investigated the entire case and I am more convinced than ever that there is a frame-up and a plot behind these arrests. Gompers declared. Standing with the AFL president in declaring the McNamara case of fraud was the Socialist Party and its press, as well as prominent public spokespersons. During April 1911, the party's National Executive Committee pledged support to the BSIW and called on party locals throughout the country to form joint defense groups with the unions. The party also released a pamphlet which placed the McNamara case in the context of a nationwide class struggle. It concerns the labor movement. It is not an isolated incident. It is just one more battle in the long struggle between organized wealth and organized humanity. In California, especially within the last 2 or 3 years, the labor unions and the Socialist Party have been making a steadily winning fight against the hitherto unbridled exploitation of labor by capital. These capitalists are growing desperate. 32. The Socialists believed that employer desperation provided the explanation for the initiation of the attack on the McNamaras. The opponents of unionism, fixing the stigma of crime on them, hoped to smash unionism, observed the New York Call. They hope, through accomplishing their execution, to beat all workers into meekness, to terrorize them into submission, and thereby render it easier to exploit them. 33. Added to the formal organization statement was the powerful voice of Eugene V. Debs, the party's leader, who declared in the Socialist Weekly, "Appeal to reason. I want to express my deliberate opinion that the Times and its crowd of union haters are the instigators if not the actual perpetrators of that crime and the murder of 20 human beings." And Debs cried out, "Arouse ye hosts of labor and swear that the villainous plot shall not be consummated." 34. A temporary united front developed around the McNamara case between the Socialists and the AFL leadership. The basis for unity lay in their conviction that the McNamaras were innocent of any involvement in the Times explosion. Even though the MCN Amaras were members of the AFL, the IWW, too, rallied to their defense, calling the whole thing a frame up by the Merchants and Manufacturers Association for the purpose of destroying labor organizations. 35*, but the IWW suggested only one defense tactic: the general strike. Strike, appealed William D. Big Bill Haywood, the IWW leader. Fold your arms for one day, the day the McNamaras go on trial, is all that will be necessary. 36. On June 18, 1911, 80,000 working men and women met in mass meeting in Chicago to voice their protest against the efforts of the United States Steel Corporation to hang J. McNamara and wreck union labor. The resolutions adopted summed up the approach of most trade unions and socialists to the McNamara case. They read, "Whereas, on April 22, 1911, the latest outrage of organized capital against organized labor was committed by the unlawful kidnapping of J. McNamara from his office at Indianapolis and carrying him, without due process of law, 3,000 miles to Los Angeles, there to be tried on the charge of having murdered men he never saw and never knew, and whereas, the charge is made against McNamara in name, but against union labor in fact. Therefore, be it resolved, by the trade unionists and socialists of Chicago, that the arrest and kidnapping of J. McNamara is in violation of the fundamental law of the United States and of common right and justice, and be it further resolved, that we affirm our faith in J. McNamara and pledge to his defense our moral and financial support, and be it further resolved, that a copy of these resolutions be given to the press and a copy sent to J. McNamara and his brother in jail in Los Angeles. 37. The BSIW asked Clarence Darrow to conduct the defense, but the Chicago labor lawyer, who was in ill health, delayed his decision. Meanwhile, BSIW President Frank Ryan engaged Job Harriman, the California socialist, as the principal attorney for the defense. However, Gompers believed that it was essential that Darrow undertake the defense, and he visited Chicago to plead with him to defend the Bruce Roger. A Wobbly warned, however, that should the facts prove that the bomb had indeed been set by a member of the BSIW, the view that the affair was a frame-up would backfire. What then? He asked. Shall we join with the masters in hounding to the gallows and death a member of the working class, who, acting individually, and smarting under some form of capitalist tyranny, set with his hand the deadly fuse? Should not the IWW be prepared, under such a development, he went on, to applaud his brave and courageous deed? To this, the editor of the Industrial Worker replied, the workers have nothing to gain by violence, although it is surprising that there are not more acts of vengeance on the part of men who are driven by the lash of hunger. The following are the words of Francesco Ferrer. That which violence wins for us today, another act of violence may wrest from us tomorrow. Ed. Industrial Worker, November 17, 1910. Francisco Ferrer, 1859–1909, Spanish philosophical anarchist and founder of the Escuela Moderna in Barcelona, where he introduced reform principles in education, was executed by government authorities after being convicted on flimsy evidence for complicity in insurrection. His execution stirred worldwide protests. McNamara's. The defense plans had originally included McManigal until he repeated his confession to District Attorney Fredericks and thereafter remained on the side of the prosecution. Darrow finally gave his reluctant consent, but estimated that $350,000 would be needed. Gompers promised to get it. Darrow then announced that it was his duty to combat the powerful forces of society in the courts, and that he would administer the defense in the McNamara case. 38 He assembled a highly competent staff including pro-labor Judge Cyrus F. McNutt of Indiana, Job Harriman, LeCompte Davis, and Joseph Scott, the latter two being local lawyers of excellent reputation. District Attorney Fredericks accepted aid from both the M and Mond the Nom. As for their Rectors Association, he came co-consider it as one of his clients. 39. On May 5, 1911, when the defendants were arraigned, they pleaded not guilty in a call to labor issued the next day. The AFL Executive Council assumed responsibility for the McNamara case and began soliciting money for the defense. While conducting the campaign for the defense, it emphasized that no member of organized labor sympathized with crime. Indeed, it went on, organized labor is opposed to, and is a standing protest against violence and crime committed by anyone or by any force or authority. But even as organized labor was horrified by the destruction of human life and property in Los Angeles, workers could also feel the great outrage which has been committed against the accused men. The McNamaras, the AFL insisted, had been targeted by a detective agency, well known to have no hesitancy or scruples in manufacturing evidence and charges against others. One that had long been known to have spies in factories and organizations, to misdirect the grievances of workmen into violent channels. The McNamaras were the innocent victims of capitalist greed, victims of an alliance made up of the National Rectors Association, the M&M of Los Angeles, and the editor and proprietor of the Los Angeles Times, Harrison Gray Otis. Thus, the accused men would have the most formidable power and influences with which to contend. How a fair trial under such circumstances can be accorded them is difficult to understand. Still, their only hope was an adequate defense, and this would require funds. 40. To raise the $350,000 needed for the defense required an enormous effort, but the AFL organized a permanent Ways and Means Committee, so that an ample opportunity for defense may be assured. The committee appealed to all national and international unions, city central bodies, and local and federal unions for a 25 cents per capita contribution for the defense of the McNamaras. The great need of the hour is money with which to meet the heavy drains incident to the collection of evidence and other expense, made necessary to cope with the corporate wealth and unlimited means behind the prosecution. 47. McNamara defense committees were set up in cities and towns throughout the country. The defense fund was literally deluged with contributions. Only the American Federation of Musicians refused to respond. C. L. Bagley, president of Los Angeles Local 47, convinced that the brothers were guilty, persuaded his national union to refrain from assisting the defense. 42,000 of workers wore pins and buttons sold by the McNamara Ways and Means Committee, reading, McNamara Brothers Not Guilty, and Justice for the McNamaras. Kidnapped. AFL. Large audiences came to see a film produced under labor auspices that portrayed the injustice of the case, titled, A Martyr to His Cause, and subtitled, Incidents in the Life and Abduction of the Secretary-Treasurer of the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers. The premiere was held at the American Theater in Cincinnati, where it was seen by an estimated 50,000 people. 43. It began with John McNamara, a young man of 17 or 18 years of age, leaving home, bidding his father and mother goodbye. He kisses his mother affectionately, shakes his father's hand, and promises the latter to be a good boy and to play fair in all that he does. Then the film carried. McNamara through his career as a structural iron worker, foreman, and secretary-treasurer of the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers, his arrest in the union's Indianapolis office, his illegal extradition, and his arrival and confinement in Los Angeles. The script for the final two scenes reads, His message to organized labor. Scene 19. Cell. Mac, seated in his cell, is writing. As he finishes, flash on sheet, the following. To the Brotherhood of Organized Labor. In this second attempt to crush and discredit the cause we represent, I realize fully the desperation of the enemies of labor arrayed against us, but I am of good heart, for it will fail. That I am innocent of any infraction of the law in word or act needs no emphasis from me, for the truth is mighty and will prevail right speedily, and for it I shall contentedly wait. I send to all brothers and friends of Union labor the world over my earnest and affectionate greetings, with the assurance there is no villainy of which we are afraid. I am also confident that it is not asking too much of the public to suspend judgment in these matters until opportunity for a full and fair defense has been afforded. J. Mick. Back to picture. Mac, with head bent low, reads the paper, then dissolve into Scene 20. The home fireside. Close-up of mother, alone, weeping over a letter from her son. 44. Labor Day, 1911 was named McNamara Day throughout the United States. In Cleveland, St. Louis, Indianapolis, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Seattle, San Francisco, Portland, Oakland, San Diego, and Los Angeles, large and enthusiastic crowds marched, demanding the McNamara's release. 20,000 marched in open shop Los Angeles, and some rode on horseback, near the jailhouse, vowing their commitment to defeat the frame-up. They carried signs and banners with the declaration, "If the McNamaras die, 20,000 will know the reason why." 45. At other rallies, signs and banners read, "This is the big class war. The carpenter of Nazareth was crucified. They would hang the ironworker of Indianapolis, who obeys the law. The working class, who breaks the law. The capitalist class. Small wonder that," Burns wrote, "a social revolution seemed at hand." 46. The trial of the McNamaras was scheduled to begin on October 11, 1911. During the preceding days, McNamara defense committees staged meetings, demonstrations, and parades, in order to show the ruling class. The organized workers are on the alert. 47. In New Orleans, the joint McNamara Committee, which included the Central Trades and Labor Council and the Socialist Party, brought thousands of workers together to protest the frame-up. Speaker after speaker emphasized that the McNamara case was simply the fight of organized capital against organized labor. P. A. Cooley, a member of the executive board of the Structural Iron Workers, offered an additional explanation. He related the 6-year fight of the structural iron workers against the United States Steel Corporation, and declared that the organization was the only one of many that had succeeded in winning out against that corporation. Hence the attack on the leadership. 48. The day before the trial opened, Gompers told 15,000 people in Philadelphia that he had just come from Los Angeles, where the McNamaras had assured him of their innocence, and that when he had left J. McNamara, the latter took his hand and, looking him in the eye, declared, "Sam, I want to send a message by you to organized labor and all you may meet. Tell them we're innocent, that we are the victims of an outrageous plot." After Gompers had concluded the speeches with the declaration that the McNamaras were being tried on charges we know to be absolutely false, thousands paraded through the streets, carrying signs which included the widely publicized slogan, "If the McNamaras die, 20,000 will know the reason why." 49. 60 correspondents were present in Los Angeles on October 11 to report developments to all the important American papers and to others in London, Paris, and Berlin. By October 15, Darrow knew that the prosecution had gathered masses of damaging evidence. 3 days later, he learned that U.S. Attorney General George Wickersham had other evidence secured through a federal subpoena sanctioned by President William Howard Taft. He now believed that an acquittal was entirely out of the question. There were 21 separate indictments against the two brothers, and Darrow later wrote, "The situation looked hopeless to me, for even though we might get a disagreement, or not guilty, in the first case, there were all the others, which would make endless trials possible. I knew that the state would never submit to defeat so long as there was any hope for them to win. So meanwhile, the trial proceeded, day after day, mired in the preliminary procedure of jury selection. By October 25, the first veneer of 125 talisman had been exhausted and only 6 of them had been seated on the jury. By November 7, the jury box was finally filled. Throughout these weeks, the labor movement stood solidly behind the McNamaras. In November, the AFL convention intensified its fundraising by assessing all officials 1 week's pay. The delegates sent a message to the McNamaras assuring them that the AFL believed in their innocence and would continue to give them both moral and financial support. Gompers repeated his statement that the case was a plot to wreck organized labor. 51. But Darrow was suffering from anxieties, doubts, and depression. All of his attempts to gather favorable evidence and witnesses had failed. Defense witnesses and relatives of the McNamaras alike were so thoroughly harassed by detectives that they were evicted from their quarters and fired from their jobs. Burns operatives infiltrated the McNamara defense staff in Los Angeles, and by means of a dictaphone, the prosecution was able to record conversations held in the McNamara's jail cells. It was at this juncture, in the middle of November, that Lincoln Steffens arrived in Los Angeles. The noted muckraker had heard of the case while in London. He tells us in his famous autobiography of a talk with Keir Hardie, who had read of the McNamara case in the English press. The British Labour leader convinced Steffens that he should go to Los Angeles and find out just why conservative organizations like for the role of the muckrakers. See next chapter. Labor unions would hire dynamiters in their struggle against capital. So, Steffens journeyed to California to write a series of articles for syndicated papers. He assumed that the McNamaras were guilty, and he determined to concentrate on the reasons that lay behind the act of violence. After OBTAM won nanogram permission from Judge Walter Bordwell to visit with the prisoners, he did so and told them of his intention to explain, through his newspaper articles, the conditions leading labor to the use of dynamite. Justifiable dynamiting was to be his defense of the McNamaras, and he wanted the prisoners' agreement to help him uncover the facts of labor's case against capital. Steffens later recalled that J.B. McNamara responded favorably to this fantastic proposition, since the muckraker was doing what the brothers wanted done above all, to force attention to the actual conditions of labor, that led trade union leaders to resort to violence. But J. McNamara was skeptical and asked Steffens, "Have you seen Darrow about this?" However, both brothers finally consented, subject to Darrow's approval. When Steffens did see Darrow, the defense lawyer was stunned by the proposition suggesting that the McNamaras had actually set off the dynamite. Nevertheless, apparently convinced that the defense was on extremely shaky ground, he instructed Steffens to stand by and watch the progress of the case. 53. That weekend, November 19 to 20, Darrow and Steffens went to visit publisher E.W. Scripps at his ranch near San Diego. After supper, Darrow reviewed the distressing state of the case for the defense, and out of the conversation came a suggestion by Darrow for a possible settlement out of court. With Scripps' strong encouragement, Steffens formulated a plan to transform Darrow's desire into reality. All that was needed, he believed, was to convert the Los Angeles capitalists to the principles of scientific Christianity *, and to convince the heads of whether or not Darrow shared Steffens' belief that the boys were really guilty is difficult to determine accurately. Most historians of the case believe he stated as much privately even before Steffens appeared on the scene. Darrow certainly said so openly in retrospect. Steffens' theory of scientific Christianity, which he was now to put to the test, was based on the belief that evil results not from bad men, but from bad conditions, and that the big businessmen, not the officials, actually govern every city. Since he was convinced that the big bad men of business, sinners, just like any others, were never asked to do good, they therefore never did good. To improve society, all one had to do was to ask its commanders to be magnanimous and show them that magnanimity paid. Steffens had previously asked the big sinners for help for people, and they had never failed to deliver. I had been looking for a chance to try it more openly in a more spectacular situation which all men could see. The McNamara case gave him that chance to try out Christianity as a working principle among sinners. Lincoln Steffens, The Autobiography of Lincoln. Steffens, New York, 1931, pp. 525, 670-71. Industry in the open shop city that the best way to end the continuing war with labor was to sponsor a deal between the prosecution and defense in the McNamara case. In return for letting the prisoners off with prison terms or possibly even letting them go free, labor could be convinced that it should cease its costly war, and all would be peace and harmony. 54. Steffens went directly to Meyer Lissner, the Los Angeles reform leader, with the proposal that the business leaders should approach the case in a spirit of reconciliation, have the MCNMRs released, and call a conference of business and labor leaders to put Los Angeles firmly on the path to progress. Stephens offered to demonstrate the practicability of his scheme by converting the most difficult men on a list drawn up by listener, and even agreed to accept the challenge of securing the support of publisher Otis. Unable to meet with Otis, he conferred with his son-in-law, Harry Chandler. Surprisingly, he won over both Chandler and Otis, and the latter gave his support to the idea of a settlement when Stephens presented it to him. Chandler agreed to negotiate with District Attorney Fredericks and to inform Otis when the bargain had been completed, while Stephens was to negotiate with Darrow. A representative group of business leaders then met and endorsed the compromise. They resolved that arrangements be made for a meeting between citizens representing labor for the purpose of considering such methods as may be practicable for bringing about an improvement of relations existing between the employer and the employee in the community. 55. The plan to be submitted to District Attorney Fredericks, with the approval of the Los Angeles businessmen, included the proposal that the MCNMRs should go unpunished and that further pursuit of other suspects should be abandoned. But Fredericks balked. Although willing to sell out of court, he refused to even consider any proposal involving no punishment for the McNamara's. As Grace Hillman Stimson points out, the National Erectors Association had heard of the Los Angeles negotiations and was pressing for uncompromising terms. 56. The district attorney therefore demanded that the MCNMRs plead guilty, that James receive a life sentence and John a shorter term in prison, possibly 10 years. 57. The proposal, modified to meet the district attorney's conditions, was then placed before the two defendants. James McNamara at first opposed any settlement which involved his brothers pleading guilty. He himself was prepared to hang, if necessary, to save his brother's life, but he would not have John, as a union official, plead guilty and cast a shadow over organized labor. Darrow, however, while insisting that no one must die, made it clear that settlement out of court was possible only if both brothers pleaded guilty. James then agreed. 58. Darrow immediately wired Gompers to send somebody to represent the AFL, without disclosing just what was involved. Edward N. Knuckles, secretary of the Chicago Federation of Labor, made the trip. At first, he balked as Darrow sadly outlined the deal involving pleas of guilty by the McNamaras. But after the status of the case was pointed out to him in detail, and he heard Darrow insist that it was hopeless to expect anything but a guilty verdict, Knuckles was convinced that, under all the circumstances, it was for the best. 59. Stephens and Darrow had entertained the hope that only J. B. McNamara, charged with actually setting the explosion, would have to plead guilty. But they soon came to realize that this would not work. They realized, too, that the open-shop Los Angeles capitalists had more in mind than a desire to accept the golden rule when they agreed to Stephens' proposition. Their problem was that a mayoralty election was set for December 5, that Job Harriman, the socialist candidate, was a seeming victor, and that Harriman would be an incooperative mayor in the struggle to keep Los Angeles an open-shop town, since he was allied with the city's labor movement. They were also convinced that if the trial was still in progress on Election Day, considering the widespread belief that the McNamaras were innocent victims of a frame-up, Harriman was certain to win. Even if the trial ended before the election with a guilty verdict, public opinion would still be much the same. Only a confession of guilt by the MCNMRs before the election could ensure a Harriman defeat and a victory for the businessmen's candidate, the incumbent Mayor Alexander. It is clear, then, that the defense's bargaining power was very limited. Then an incident occurred that completely undermined it. Darrow was charged with an attempt at jury bribing. He was supposed to have been seen publicly passing the bribe money to Burt Franklin, chief of the detectives hired by the defense. In the wake of this episode, any chance of getting the preliminary plan accepted by District Attorney Fredericks went out the window. 60. On Friday, December 1, 1911, both McNamaras came to court. J. McNamara was not on trial and had not been in the courtroom before. Everyone suspected that something important was about to happen. Lecomte Davis quietly informed the court that the defense desired to change its plea. James B. McNamara then pleaded guilty before Judge Bordwell to the crime of murder at 5:45 p.m. on the night of September 30, 1910. He had placed in Ink Alley, a part of the Times building, a suitcase containing 16 sticks of dynamite, set to explode at 1 o'clock the next morning. It was my intention, he said, to injure the building and scare the owners. I did not intend to take the life of anyone. I sincerely regret that unfortunate men lost their lives. If the giving of my life could bring them back, I would gladly give it. His brother, John J. McNamara, pleaded guilty as an accessory to the dynamiting of the Llewellyn Iron Works. 61. The McNamaras had carried out their part of the agreement by pleading guilty. But they soon discovered that the prosecution and the judge had reneged on two aspects of the agreement. At the request of the district attorney, Judge Bordwell, on December 5, sentenced J. B. McNamara to life imprisonment rather than death, but instead of the expected 10 years, he sentenced John McNamara to 15. Moreover, instead of a kindly, humane statement from the bench, as had been promised to Stephens, Bordwell bitterly denounced both prisoners as vicious criminals and would not admit any extenuating circumstances for their crime. 62. On December 9, 1911, James and John McNamara were taken under heavy guard from the Los Angeles jail. The next morning, escorted by 12 armed guards, the brothers entered San Quentin prison. On the day following the confession of guilt, the streets of Los Angeles were strewn with Harriman for mayor buttons flung into the gutters by thousands of voters overcome with feelings of anger and disgust. The election returns on December 5 made it clear that the McNamara confessions were the deciding factor in turning a socialist victory into a disastrous defeat. Alexander was re-elected by a 35,000-vote majority. The Times gloated in its editorial the following day, "The voice of the people is the voice of God." Yesterday in Los Angeles, God's people spoke, and the enemies of God stand confused. Scoffing, anarchistic socialism has been crushed as far as this city is concerned with the same swift, merciless annihilation that the heel of a giant crushes the head of a reptile. 63. At a station in New Jersey, an Associated Press reporter boarded a Pullman car and awakened Samuel Gompers in his berth. The aged labor leader's eyes moistened as he read the dispatch. "I am astounded. I am astounded," he repeated, insisting that right up to that moment, he had believed the brothers to be innocent. "The McNamaras have betrayed labor," he declared. 64. In a statement issued from AFL headquarters entitled, "To the American Public on the McNamara Case," the 7 union officials who had made up the McNamara Ways and Means Committee declared solemnly that they had had no knowledge of the brothers' guilt until the news of the confessions appeared in the press, and that they were justified in believing that it was a gas explosion that had wrecked the Times building and in accepting the word of the McNamaras that they were not guilty. They continued, "Organized labor of America has no desire to condone the crimes of the McNamaras. It joins in the satisfaction that the majesty of the law and justice have been maintained and the culprits commensurately punished for the CNME. And yet it is an awful commentary upon existing conditions when any one man among all the millions of workers can bring himself to the frame of mind that the only means to secure justice for labor is in violence, outrage and murder." 65. Labor leaders everywhere joined in repudiating the McNamaras, and the complaint was widely voiced that they had not received the heaviest possible punishment, death. 66. The position of the Socialist Party and its organs, however, was quite different. While conceding that the crimes committed by the McNamaras should be unqualifiedly condemned, the movement would not retract one word from its defense of the McNamaras in the case. The Socialists had fought for a fair trial of labor officials against the lawless acts of General Otis and his associates and representatives in their efforts to predetermine the verdict, and would do it again if it faced a similar situation. If today there should be a similar kidnapping on a similar charge, the Socialists would plunge into the fight. 67 inches. The conference has nothing to hide and no apologies to make, the Socialist McNamara Defense Fund of New York City declared in its final report. In the future, as in the past, we shall stand ready to assert the solidarity of the working class, to condemn murder whether the murderers be propertied or the propertyless element of society, and to resist to the best of our ability all attacks on the interests of the working class. 68. In the midst of the fierce chorus of denunciation with which labor leaders and the labor press repudiated the McNamara brothers, here and their voice was raised in their defense. Those who did so emphasized 2 points in urging the American people to temper their judgment of the McNamaras, even while condemning their acts. First, an actual state of war existed between the forces of capital and labor, and secondly, the crimes of the McNamaras paled into insignificance when compared with the crimes constantly being committed by capitalism. Big Bill Haywood of the IWW, who spelled out the second argument in detail, asserted at the close of his presentation, "I am with the McNamaras and always will be." 69 Debs, too, viewed the McNamaras' actions as the answer to government by injunction, anti-picketing ordinances and other capitalist devices to stay the march of labor. But in a perceptive letter to a friend after the McNamaras' confession, Debs struck at an even deeper aspect of the case. The McNamaras are the product of capitalism. They have not been taught in the refinements and delicacies of things. If you want to judge McNamara, you must first serve a month as a structural ironworker on a skyscraper, risking your life every minute to feed your wife and babies, then be discharged and blacklisted for joining a union. Every floor in every skyscraper represents a working man killed in its erection. It is easy enough for a gentleman of education and refinement to sit at his typewriter and point out the crimes of the workers. But let him be one of them himself, reared in hard poverty, denied education, thrown into the brute struggle for existence from childhood, oppressed, exploited, forced to strike, clubbed by the police, jailed while his family is evicted, and his wife and children are hungry, and he will hesitate to condemn these as criminals who fight against the crimes of which they are the victims of such savage methods as have been forced upon them by their masters. Joe. In time, more and more Americans began to understand that in the context of the sharp class struggle that characterized American society, some Unionists were bound to conclude that political and economic action were inadequate means of attaining labor's objectives. Having acquired a bitter distrust of the government and courts as a result of long experience, these Unionists had no substantial reasons to feel that their beliefs would be respected in any court of law or by any government agency. Quite naturally, then, they did not turn to these bodies when they could not secure their demands from the corporations they were battling. Instead, they came to believe and accept the idea that violence was a legitimate weapon in the class struggle. 71. There is still another aspect of the case which is too often ignored by historians. As Herbert Shapiro has pointed out, a more careful look at the McNamara case indicates that agents provocateurs may well have played a significant role in leading the Ironworkers Union to its sabotage campaign. These company agents were in a position to influence the choice of alternatives made by union leaders, and there is a good deal of evidence, according to Shapiro, that agents played a major role in organizing and implementing terroristic acts. He concludes that McManigal may well have been an agent working for Burns, noting that even prosecutor John D. Fredericks in Los Angeles had had doubts about McManigal's genuineness and that, upon meeting McManigal, he had promptly asked him if he was a Burns agent, a question to which there is no recorded reply. Shapiro is convinced, too, that Herbert S. Hawken, one of the national leaders of the Iron Workers Union, was also a Burns agent working as an agent provocateur, inciting the iron workers to acts of violence. 72. In 1957, in an interview with George H. Schoaf, formerly of the Appeal to Reason, John J. McNamara never once admitted any guilt in connection with the Times explosion. With respect to the confession, he insisted that Darrow had isolated the brothers from news of the outside and had convinced them that the public was against them. Had they known the state of the workers' solidarity, he said, they would have fought to the end. We would never have allowed ourselves to be coerced into confession to the crime charged against us. McNamara maintained that Darrow had convinced them that the situation was ominous, that the brothers were safer in jail than outside, that a fair and unbiased jury would be impossible to secure, that there had been threats to lynch them, and that in the interest of public safety it would be best if we acted on his advice, pleaded guilty and accepted lenient sentences. He continued, neither Jim nor I wanted to plead guilty. We wanted the case to go to trial. I am sure we could have stated our case so plainly, and presented facts sufficient to justify any militant action we may have taken, that a fair-minded public instead of condemning us would have understood and been sympathetic. But Darrow and Steffens overruled us, and we went to hell. 73. Ironically, it was precisely because he believed that he could get the American people to understand why the use of dynamite had been resorted to by the McNamaras that Steffens had worked out the deal in the first place. Moreover, initially, Steffens felt he had accomplished a *. Shapiro concluded that access to the records of the Bums Detective Agency would be most helpful in fully resolving this issue of the role of agents in the McNamara case, but the agency has thus far refused to open its file for the purpose of historical research. In 1931, J. B. McNamara told Esther Lowell, a reporter for the New Masses, that in the deal worked out, J. McNamara was promised release in 3 years and 3 months. B. In 7 years. Esther Lowell, California prefers hanging, New Masses. May, 1931, page 6. Great deal. He released a statement by J. McNamara accepting the settlement as a possible road to progress, in which he declared, "You don't want us to strike, you don't want us to organize, we cannot afford individually to go to law. What are we to do? If my act brings this question fairly before the world and leads to any answer except the war we have, I shall feel that, though I may be in prison, I shall be serving my cause. 74. There was good reason for Stephen's initial reaction. The McNamara case was not a clear-cut frame-up, and while the trial seemed to have ended with a one-sided compromise, the defense had succeeded in saving the brothers from the death penalty. Yet, even though the death sentence was avoided, the prison terms were severe, and J. B. McNamara died an inmate of the California prison system. For other reasons, too, Stephens came to have doubts about the success of his class reconciliation policy. He was disturbed by the hatred of the McNamaras that was being expressed in most circles, especially in the churches, and he bemoaned the fact that Christians had seemed to have rejected Christianity. In his autobiography, Stephens states that the contract between the capitalists and himself was all but reneged on by the employers. 75. A conference to reconcile labor and capital was never held. On the contrary, not only did the employers display no desire to accept unionism after the agreement had been worked out, but they had united to smash the ironworkers' strike. Los Angeles continued to be known as the open shop city. In addition, part of the agreement called for the dropping of charges against on December 11, 1926, after 15 years in San Quentin. B. McNamara wrote to Fremont Older, the California Reform publisher, "I have faith in the rank and file, and that faith will stand me well in hand in the next 6 years or so." Lincoln Stephens Papers. Columbia University Special Collections, Rare Book Room. 10 years later, America's oldest political prisoner, as he was then called, was still in jail. His release, however, was urged by the AFL convention meeting in Tampa. Reporting this action, the Daily Worker, organ of the Communist Party, noted, "For 25 years he U.B. McNamara has suffered without breaking in the California State Prison," and it added, "McNamara went to jail to save other labor leaders from a like fate." Lieutenant cited the deal made by Stephens with the biggest capitalist politicians and masters of industry in California, in which, it asserted the latter, promised faithfully, that if the McNamaras confessed, all other attempts to convict other labor leaders would be dropped. But the promise was never kept. Daily Worker, November 28, 1936. B. McNamara died of cancer in San Quentin on March 12, 1941, at the age of 59, after spending 30 years in prison. His last words to his friends were, "I will find my freedom only in the liberation of the working class. Whether that occurs while I am in San Quentin prison or out is of minor importance to me." People's World, March 10, 1941. At the time of his death. B. McNamara was a member of the Communist Party. Most unions suffered severe losses in membership during the early months of 1912, and the Central Labor Council and the councils of the metal trades and the building trades were badly crippled. Any individuals other than the McNamaras, but this pledge, too, had not been kept. Instead, a federal trial took place of members of the Iron Workers Union who had been arrested on charges stemming out of the dynamiting incidents, and convictions of 38 of them were secured. 76 according to both Stephens and current newspaper accounts. Charges were also to have been dropped against 2 labor radicals, Matthew Schmidt and David Kaplan, who had been indicted along with the McNamaras. This pledge, too, was violated. Efforts to locate Kaplan and Schmidt continued, and they were finally arrested, brought back to California, and sentenced to long prison terms. 77. The most immediate sequels to the McNamara case, however, were Clarence Darrow's trials on the juror bribery charge. A second trial resulted from the jury's inability to reach a verdict in the first proceedings. Darrow was not willing to defend the McNamaras as legally innocent, but he insisted on explaining that the real cause of the explosion at the Times lay in the workings of an oppressive system. He warned the jury that the McNamara incident was not the end of industrial terrorism. These acts of violence, he declared, will occur over and over again until the human race is wise enough to bring more justice and more equality to the affairs of life than has ever obtained before. During the second trial, Darrow gave a clear answer to the question of who was ultimately responsible for deaths caused by industrial terror. It is the men who have reached out their hands and taken possession of all the wealth of the world. It is the owners of the great railroad systems. It is the Rockefellers, it is the Morgans, it is the Golds, it is that paralyzing hand of wealth which has reached out and destroyed all the opportunities of the poor. And their acts are protests against their wrongs. 78. The second trial in 1913 ended with the jury in disagreement, and eventually the charges were quietly dropped. Long before this, Lincoln Steffens had reached the conclusion that Christianity will not work, I may have to admit it. 79. Yet a question remained that still had to be answered. What are we Americans going to do, Steffens asked, about conditions which are bringing up healthy, good-tempered boys like the McNamara boys to really believe, as they most sincerely do they in a growing group of labor, that the only recourse they have for improving the conditions of the wage earner is to use dynamite against property and life? B.O. Her 30, 1911 to the answers it received. They differed considerably, but there was general and significant agreement that actual class warfare existed in the United States and that the conditions leading to that warfare had to be changed. 81. While conducting this symposium, the editors of the survey joined with social reformers in a series of conferences in New York City to decide what else might be done. Out of these conferences there emerged, in time to be printed in the survey's symposium issue, a petition to President Taft urging him to support an inquiry into the causes for violence in industry. Among the signers of the appeal were Lillian Wald, Jane Addams, Henry Morgenthau, Paul Kellogg, Louis Brandeis, Irving Fisher, E. A. Ross, and Rev. John Haynes Holmes, all nationally known as reformers. The signers applauded the settlement of the McNamara case and found that the public had said no to violence. But they went on to state that while the avenue of political action was open in this country, there was genuine reason to doubt that the channel of economic action was likewise open. Economic freedom, they maintained, was undermined by such measures as labor espionage and injunctions. The signers pointed to the chasm that might lie ahead, and they repeated Lincoln's statement that a house divided against itself cannot stand. They expressed the desire to have light shed on the larger lawlessness which is beyond the view of the criminal court. BZ. President Taft recommended to Congress the creation of an inquiry into industrial relations. The request was caught up in the electoral politics of 1912, and congressional approval was delayed until Woodrow Wilson took office in 1913 and could submit his own nominees to conduct the inquiry. 83. The United States Industrial Commission, which was designated to perform this task, was presided over by Frank P. Walsh. It devoted some attention to the McNamara case, but it went into many other labor struggles and played an important role in educating public opinion about the realities of the labor-capital conflict. The McNamara case occurred in the midst of the emerging progressive movement and had a profound effect on developments during the progressive era. We shall now turn our attention to this movement and this era, and analyze the role of organized labor in their emergence and development. Chapter 2. Labor and the Progressive Movement. The political activities of organized labor after 1900 took place in a period generally called the Progressive Era. The reform movements that characterized this era drew their strength from agrarian and middle-class elements and laborites. Their roots lay deep in the greenback labor, anti-monopoly, and populist movements of the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, in which these classes had united temporarily to found a third party of national dimensions aimed at ending big business domination over the economic and political life of the nation. William Jennings. Bryan's defeat in the election of 1896 sounded the death knell of populism, and the capitalists and their allies were confident that they no longer had to fear such radical movements, that the people were tired of the decades of agitation against the monopolists and wanted only an end to the warfare. The muckrakers. But the ideas planted by the earlier radical movements lived on. They received new impetus through the widely read exposés of a whole school of writers, journalists, college professors, reformers, ministers, and public officials. In the decade between 1903 and 1912, over 2,000 articles exposing the evils in American society appeared in such magazines as McClure's, Collier's, Munsey's, Pound, 1. Jaributy's, Frank Leslie's, Cosmopolitan, Independent, and American Magazine. These magazines sold for 10 or 15 cents a copy, instead of the 25 and 35 cents charged by the older magazines, and the articles of exposure, supplemented as they were by editorials, cartoons, and serials, opened the eyes of millions of Americans to the rapid spread of corruption and social injustice which had accompanied the development of monopoly capitalism. Thomas W. Lawson exposed the Money Trust, 1902, Ida M. Tarbell, the Oil Trust, 1903, Charles Edward Russell, the Beef Trust, 1905, Ray Stannard Baker, the Railroads, 1906, and the alliance between corrupt labor leaders and the trusts at the expense of the unorganized workers and the public, 1903-1904, David Graham Phillips, the Senate, 1906, Burton J. Hendricks, the operations of life insurance companies, 1906, and Lincoln Steffens, the ties between business, the underworld, and the system of political power. In the Shame of the Cities, 1904, originally published as a series of articles in McClure's The Struggle for Self-Government, 1906, and The Upbuilders, 1909, Steffens demonstrated how the sovereign political power of organized business was responsible for nationwide corruption. He wrote of the big businessman, "I found him buying boodlers in St. Louis, defending grafters in Minneapolis, originating corruption in Pittsburgh, sharing with the bosses in Chicago, and beating good government with corruption in New York. He is a self-righteous fraud, this big businessman. He is the chief source of corruption." 1. During these same years, the Hearst Press, and to a lesser extent the Pulitzer newspapers, concentrated on such exposures, reaching and influencing millions of readers. In addition, a chain of socialist periodicals, The Appeal to Reason, The Comrade, Wilshire's Magazine, the International Socialist Review, and such socialist newspapers as the New York Call, the Chicago Daily Socialist, and the Cleveland Citizen published similar exposés, but, unlike the writings of the non-socialist capitalist muckrakers, theirs went to the heart of society's problems and contained both more basic criticism of that society and a proposal to solve its problems by changing the system. A stream of realistic and naturalistic literature merged with the flood of journalistic exposure. In his novel, The Octopus, 1901, Frank Norris portrayed the wheat growers in the coils of the Southern Pacific Railroad, and in The Pit, 1903, he followed them into the den of the grain speculators in Chicago. In The Jungle, the most famous book to emerge from this era, which was originally serialized in The Appeal to Reason, the socialist Upton Sinclair combined a picture of the exploitatee of the bohemian immigrant workers in the Chicago stockyards with a vivid depiction of the disease-breeding filth of the meatpacking industry. Another socialist, Jack London, in The Iron Heel, 1908, dramatically pictured the control of American life by the capitalist oligarchy and predicted that it would use force to prevent the working class, led by the socialists, from taking office and power once elected. During these years, too, Theodore Dreiser probed incisively into the effect of the social system on morals, human relations, and human character in works like Sister Carrie, 1900, Jenny Gerhardt, 1911, The Financier, 1911, and The Titan, 1914.2. Muckraking magazines carried a number of articles dealing with labor issues, especially child labor, women workers, industrial safety, convict labor, and the evils of home work in tenement factories. In his novel, The Jungle, Upton Sinclair vividly portrayed the life of workers in the Chicago meatpacking industry. In the main, however, the problems facing laboring people were not of concern to the muckrakers. The only one to deal extensively with organized labor was Ray Stannard Baker, and, as Leroy Henry Schramm points out, Baker's attitude was and remained ambivalent. Unions were necessary, but potentially dangerous. The truth is that Baker saw powerful labor as a greater threat than the giant corporate interests. 3. While organized labor was critical of the muckrakers' failure to concern themselves to any great extent with the wages and working conditions of American labor, it leapt to their defense when they were attacked by President Theodore Roosevelt. On April 14, 1906, Roosevelt fastened the title of muckrakers upon the journalists who wrote of corruption in American life. He drew the term from Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, in which one of the figures was the man with the asterisk in addition to Upton Sinclair. Socialists among the muckrakers included such leading figures as Jack London, Charles Edward Russell, Rita Childs Dorr, Gustavus Myers, John Reed, William English Walling, John Spargo, W. J. Gent, A. M. Simons, Reginald Wright Kaufman, and Robert Hunter. Through the writings of these men and women and the analysis they presented of the reasons for corruption and social injustice, the socialists, as Louis Filler points out, became the outstanding educational force to be found in every field where reform was in progress. Crusaders for American Liberalism, Yellow Springs, Ohio, 1939, p. 124, Sinclair wrote his book as a tract for socialism, seeking to expose the oppression of the working class, but the American consumer took the book as a warning that the quality of meat must be improved. I aimed at the public heart, Sinclair wrote, and by accident I hit in the stomach. The jungle was important in mobilizing public support for a federal meat inspection act. Muckrake, who could look no way but downward. The muckraking journalists, Roosevelt charge, concentrated so much on exposing the small percentage of evil in American society that they failed to see the predominant good. The International Woodworker voiced the opinion of most trade union journals in criticizing Roosevelt. It is not because the muckrake men were stirring up the filthy things below that prompted President Roosevelt to rush to the rescue, for which he received the approbation of all plutocratic corruptionists, bribe takers, and bribe givers, together with other evildoers, official and unofficial, who were quaking in their boots lest they might be the next to have their methods exposed in the light of publicity by the muckrakers. Their real offense, the Union Journal insisted, was that, because of them, the people were learning how the giant corporations were extending their influence into every corner of national life, corrupting it as they proceeded, and how the great industrial and public utility corporations, Wall Street, the trusts, and monopolies ran the two major parties. The system, as the muckrakers called the alliance between big business and government, pervaded every facet of American life, and it was because they dared to expose this truth that they had brought the president's wrath down upon themselves. Point 4. The system. One magazine writer in 1905 described the governing institution in the United States as government of the corporations and privileged interests, under political machines and their tools and their beneficiaries, for the enormous enrichment of the privileged few and for the perpetuation of machine rule. This description was clear to all who were familiar with the operations of the system. 1. It operated in the nomination and election of candidates. As one journalist pointed out in Frank Leslie's in 1903. In a presidential or congressional election, the great corporations pick the candidates and the party to whom they feel they can look for favors. Then they contribute enormous sums to carry the election. Frequently a definite bargain is made with the national committee that something shall be done or another one not done. It is a cold matter of business. Commercial acumen, which has Roosevelt, was alarmed by the fact that the literature of exposure was producing an enormous increase in the socialist propaganda, and building up a revolutionary feeling. E. Morrison, The Letters of Theodore Roosevelt, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1951, Volume V, page 183. Built up vast fortunes in a generation or two, like those of the Standard Oil crowd or Carnegie's coterie of young men, can usually pick a winner or make a winner in a national campaign. Other writers demonstrated that the same power existed in municipal and state elections. The boss and the machine, responsible to the big business groups who financed the campaigns, selected candidates who would serve the needs of the powerful corporations. 2. The system operated full-time in Congress. In the Senate, there was little need for pressure to be applied for big business to gain its ends. The upper house was filled with oil magnates, mine owners, and directors of banks and railroads, all elected by state legislatures controlled by these corporations. The atmosphere was one of an exclusive businessmen's club. The Senate was actually called the Millionaires' Club, and senators were almost as widely known by the particular economic interests they represented as by the state from which they came. The House of Representatives was, of course, more dependent on popular vote. Occasionally, then, a progressive measure might be permitted by the party leaders to pass the House, with the understanding that it would be lost or smothered in the Senate. In the main, however, such bills were referred to committees and by them to subcommittees, from which they were never to emerge. Committees and subcommittees, in such cases, were not called by their chairman, or, if called, could not muster a quorum. Extended and delaying hearings were granted. Jokers were added to the bills that effectively emasculated them. Uncle Joe Cannon, the Speaker of the House, always loyal to the interests of the corporations, drew up the membership of important committees so that they would be a graveyard of all progressive measures. 3. In state and city governments, big business control was even more direct. Describing the situation in New Jersey, a writer pointed out, the legislation proposed for the people was all scrutinized at the Camden and Amboy Railroad Company's offices in Trenton and allowed to go through if the company were favorable or indifferent, but its disapproval doomed it to certain defeat. It selected the governor of the state, picked out the men who were to go to Congress, and named United States senators. So absolute was its control of all the departments of the state government that the state itself became known among the people of other states as the state of Camden and Amboy. It went into the cities and controlled councils and mayors with the same iron hand. 5. For the same reasons, Delaware was known as the state of DuPont, California as the state of the Southern Pacific Railroad, New York as the state of Wall Street, and Pennsylvania as the state of Standard Oil and U.S. Steel. Burton J. Hendricks charged in 1910 that under Boss Thomas C. Platt, The Republican Party in New York became simply the intermediary through which the corporations assumed the functions of government. At election time, corporations handed over generous sums to the state committee. These were distributed to the various districts in order to elect the party's candidates to the legislature. In turn, successful candidates recognized their obligations to those who had sent them to Albany. Corporations told Platt which bills they wished to have killed, and Platt passed the word on to his legislative henchmen. Through the patronage, big business was also assured of friendly administrative action in the various state departments. During the 1906 campaign, Timothy L. Woodruff, Platt's lieutenant, admitted to a group of labor leaders that the party had not been able to listen to workingmen up to then because 95% of its campaign contributions came from corporations. 6. The great majority of city governments were controlled by bosses and machines operating in behalf of powerful corporate interests. The latter paid handsomely in bribes to get control of franchises, city contracts, and other forms of public privileges. In Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, St. Louis, Memphis, etc., the story was everywhere the same. The orgy of plunder by the Tweed Ring in New York was only a tame example of municipal misgovernment when compared with the revelations during the opening decade of the 1900s. The politicians, servants of the corporations, handed over to their control huge slices of the city's wealth in the form of gas, electric, and transit franchises, and various other types of concessions. No limit was imposed by statute on the duration of such grants. Consequently, they were almost always given in perpetuity or in some cases for 999 years. Towns, cities, and states signed away for all-time rights which would become more and more valuable as time went on. These and other similar concessions to corporate wealth were pushed through state legislatures and municipal councils with scarcely a dissenting vote. 7. By the turn of the 20th century, the political boss had become an institution in American political life. But the real bosses were the interests which stood behind him, with the power to buy and sell. The carefully documented exposures of the muckrakers made it abundantly clear that the ousting of the system would not be an easy task. In most regions of the country, the state and city machines of both old parties were so well oiled and so well entrenched, and the business groups controlling the bosses and the machines so accustomed to dominating America's political life, and so determined to protect their valuable privileges, that it seemed that a miracle would be required to make headway against this corrupt alliance. The Progressive Program. The Progressive Movement set out to accomplish this miracle. In the name of the people, it sought to mobilize the political power of the people in order to wrest political control from the old line, business-dominated politicians and their corrupt organizations. This attempt to democratize the political machinery and make government more responsive to popular will was essential if substantial economic and social betterment were to be secured. It was an open secret that the elected representatives of the people were, in fact, the hired representatives of one or more business corporations. Unless greater political democracy was first achieved, the progressives insisted, economic reform and social justice were impossibilities. Thus, the Progressive Revolt revolved around two poles, political and economic reform. Both were inextricably intertwined, and neither could be viewed in isolation from the other. In general, the progressives advocated the institution of such measures, originally advanced by the populists, as the direct primary, to restore to the people the choice of their elected representatives, a limitation on campaign contributions to end big business control of the nomination and election of hand-picked candidates, the regulation of lobbyists, rules to limit the power of the Speaker of the House and to prevent the smothering of bills in committees, the election of United States senators by direct popular vote instead of by the state legislatures. A full airing of legislative actions through the publication of debates and votes, a system of initiative and referendum to enable the voters to legislate directly when necessary, a law for the recall of officials who betrayed their trust, the Australian or secret ballot, prohibition of the granting of unlimited franchises, and public ownership of public utilities. The specific demands of the various movements varied in certain respects from locality to locality, but the central idea of liberating the nation from the corrupt alliance of big business and machine politics, which was undermining representative government, and of restoring political and economic democracy to the people, was fundamental to the progressive impulse. Political reform, however, was only one of the great issues to which the American people were increasingly directing their attention during the progressive era. One particular concern which stood out was social reform, or the protection of the individual from the evils of industrialism and its corollary, urbanism. The American people were coming more and more to realize that the rushing industrialization and urbanization which had been brought about by the expansion of American business during the previous half-century had been accomplished at a great cost and human suffering. These vast economic forces, inspired by the drive for ever-increasing profits, had thrown great masses of the population, the other half, in the words of Jacob Riis, into conditions of hardship and urban squalor from which they were helpless to extricate themselves. To progressives, these conditions made a mockery of the American dream and cried out for correction by the organized efforts of society. To be sure, progressive-minded Americans were attempting to combat the evils of industrialism and urban life through private means. Settlement houses, patterned after the pioneering work done during the reform movement in Wisconsin, known as the Wisconsin Idea, under the leadership of Republican Governor Robert M. La Follette, placed major emphasis on the direct primary, reform in the method of railroad taxation, reduction of railroad rates, regulation of public utilities, a Corrupt Practices Act to make it difficult to use large sums of money to influence nominations and elections, an anti-lobby measure to limit the power of lobbyists, an inheritance tax, and a graduated income tax. The movement in Iowa, known as the Iowa Idea, under the leadership of Republican Governor Albert B. Cummins, stressed the direct primary, regulation of the railroads, and tariff reform. The Missouri movement, under the leadership of Democratic Governor Joseph W. Folk, emphasized such reform measures as effective regulation of the railroads and public utilities, an anti-lobby law, a direct primary law, the initiative and referendum, and labor and social legislation. In Oregon, W. Uren and his People's Power League advocated a thoroughgoing series of reform measures: the Australian ballot, registration of voters, initiative, referendum, and recall, direct primary, direct election of United States Senators, a Corrupt Practices Act, and a presidential preferential primary. The Oregon system, as it came to be called, had a profound effect throughout the country. In the early movement for progressive reform in Oregon, Uren was legislative agent of the AFL, the Knights of Labor, and the Farmers Alliance and Grange in that state. Direct Legislation Record, Volume 3, March 1896, page R6, Volume V. March, 1898, pp. 19-20. The reform movements in other states differed only in detail from those described above. However, some reformers were identified chiefly with national issues. Others were concerned mainly with local or state problems. Some devoted their energies toward correcting the social evils of the time, while others concentrated on fighting corruption in business and government. 90s by Jane Addams in Chicago and Lillian Wald in New York City were appearing in scores of the nation's big cities and mobilizing the energies of thousands of scores of eager young social workers in the task of assisting society's unfortunate, especially the immigrant masses. But private efforts were not enough, and it was primarily by invoking the power of government in social affairs that progressives hoped to achieve effective solutions to the problems of industrialism and urbanism. 8. In 1963, Gabriel Kolko published The Triumph of Conservatism, in which he harshly criticized historians for labeling the period from approximate Y 1900 until the United States intervention in the war as the progressive era. Kolko argued that so-called progressivism actually represented the triumph of conservatism, that the progressives were really conservatives all along, concerned about preserving the existing distribution of wealth and power. What progressivism really amounted to, he maintained, was political capitalism, the conscious and successful attempts by the largest and most powerful business interests to use the federal government in order to achieve a measure of stability in the economic and social order that private efforts had failed to bring about. 9. Since the revisionism of Kolko, and, to a lesser extent, of James Weinstein, a number of historians have begun to speak of the so-called progressive era, and, in an obituary to the progressive movement, Peter Filene states flatly, the progressive movement never existed. 11 But historians have nonetheless continued to refer to the progressive era. At the same time, they have been calling for a clearer understanding of the role played by organized labor. The need for this is clear. Whatever their differences, recent historians of the progressive era have generally agreed that the reform impulse which swept across the nation during the first decade and a half of the 20th century was a response to the impact of industrialism on American society, that the progressive movement was the result of an attempt to cope with this rapid transformation of American social and economic institutions, and that the reform movement was most vigorous in the urban areas most affected by the industrial change and growth. All of these historians have emphasized the role of the urban middle classes in the reform movement and have credited them with whatever results were achieved by the movement for social and economic reforms. The urban working class, the group most affected by the transformation of American society, and the role of organized labor have received only scant attention in studies of the progressive era. Then, in 1962, Joseph Huffmacher suggested that organized labor was deeply interested in the bread and butter reforms of the progressive movement, that the urban workers supported progressive candidates with their ballots, and that the social workers, the unions, and middle-class reformers often worked together. 12. in a case study of the state of New York, published 3 years later. Erwin Y. Elowitz emphasized that organized labor had a strong interest in the work of the progressives. His work investigated the relationship between labor and the social progressives, those who believed that social justice was the prime object of progressivism, and disclosed that the labor unions and social progressives were actively, if not successfully, seeking to carry out the reforms desired by the workers and the lower class. Y. Elowitz called for studies of this relationship in other states and in cities as well. 13 Since 1965, the role of organized labor in politics during the progressive era has become a subject of increasing interest among historians. By now it is clear that the history of the progressive era cannot be fully written until this important phase of the story is included. Labor and direct legislation. A major contribution of organized labor to the progressive impulse lay in initiating and advancing the cause of direct legislation, perhaps the key demand of the entire progressive movement. The first to bring the idea of the initiative and referendum to popular attention was James William Sullivan, national lecturer for the AFL on direct legislation. In 1894, a newspaper declared editorially, "The man who has done most for the referendum and initiative in this country is Mr. J. W. Sullivan, now national lecturer for the American Federation of Labor on direct legislation. He has been an indefatigable educator concerning this new asterisk in his study of modern American reform." Eric Goldman makes no mention of organized labor's role prior to the New Deal era. Rendezvous with Destiny, New York, 1953. Richard Hofstadter mentions it only once in his study of the reform movement, The American Political Tradition, New York, 1948, page 239. George E. Mowry has only one paragraph on labor in his study of the years 1900 to 1912, the era of Theodore Roosevelt, 1900 to 1912, New York, 1958, page 11. Samuel P. Hayes devotes only a few pages, most of which are of a general nature, in his study of the response to industrialism in the period from 1880 to 1914, The Response to Industrialism, 1880 to 1914, Chicago, 1957, pp. 63 to 69. In March, 1897, the direct legislation record called Sullivan, the father of the direct legislation movement in the United States, Volume IV, page 19. The same issue contained a biographical sketch of Sullivan. System. 14 Sullivan, a member of the Typographical Union, began investigating direct legislation in 1883, and 5 years later, he went to Switzerland to study it firsthand. Returning after a year's stay, he began a campaign to interest the trade unions in the movement. At first, he emphasized the importance of having labor organizations adopt the initiative and referendum in their own operations. Asterisk. In 1892, Sullivan published direct legislation by the citizenry through the initiative and referendum, in which he discussed the Swiss system of direct legislation and called upon the labor movement in the United States to take the lead in establishing it in this country. As he saw it, direct legislation offered the workers a quick and effective way of solving their basic problems. In a chapter entitled, "The Way Open to Peaceful Revolution," he wrote, "Today in the United States, in scores, nay, hundreds of industrial communities, the wage working class is in the majority. If the wage workers, a majority in a direct vote, should demand in all public work the short-hour day, they would get it. Further, the wage workers might vote anti-Pinkerton ordinances, compel during strikes the neutrality of the police, and place judges from their own ranks at least in the local courts. Eventually," he went on, "the labor organizations might supply the framework of a political party such as had almost elected Henry George mayor of New York in 1886, and with the wage workers now in political ascendancy, could use direct legislation to get the full product of their labor." 15. In 1893, Sullivan became a national lecturer for the AFL on direct legislation. In articles in the American Federationist and in lectures to workers and others throughout the country, he helped to make the cause of direct legislation a living force. The following account in the New York Voice of August 11, 1894 provides an illustration of his work and its effect. Haverhill, Mass., August. E.O. Special Correspondence to the Voice. It was but a few months since Mr. Sullivan came up from New York to lecture on the Swiss plan of the initiative and referendum. His address set men of Haverhill on fire, and for several weeks they thought of nothing else, and as a result of Sullivan's activity, the initiative and referendum were established for legislation and elections in a number of trade unions. Direct Legislation Record, Volume IV, 1897, pp. 66 to 68, Volume V, March, 1898, pp. 15 to 16, September, 1898, pp. 64 to 65. In 1899, however, Sullivan abandoned this aspect of the work, observing, "It is to be remembered that in the trades unions there is no need of direct legislation as in the state with its subdivisions. The unions confer no franchises, have nothing to do with corrupt legislators, and have no machine bosses." Ibid. Volume V. June 1899, page 27. Events were soon to disprove his optimistic portrayal of trade union democracy. Sullivan had campaigned for Henry George in the 1886 election. For a discussion of the United Labour Party in that campaign, see Foner, Op. Cit. Volume 2, pp. 119-29. Labored for nothing else. By effective organization and pressure, they have forced the mayor and the board of aldermen to pass without an opposing vote a measure prepared by Mr. Sullivan, for the adoption of the Australian ballot and the initiative and referendum. Thus those who have actually achieved the initiation of the initiative and the referendum are the group of men and women who comprise the Central Labour Union, with the code jutors, mostly workers in the shoe factories of Haverhill, Mass. On the whole, it must be considered one of the most notable steps democracy has taken in this country for many years. The thing was done by the people who work by day in shoe shops, but who think while they work, and think right, and who act when they are not at work. The contagion of this victory has already spread. The Massachusetts branch of the American Federation of Labor has just been holding its annual session in Boston, and has put itself definitely on record in favor of direct legislation. It arranged to inaugurate a campaign, under the supervision of Mr. Sullivan, to educate the people on the subject. As a representative of the AFL, Sullivan attended frequent conferences of direct legislation leagues in various states and helped rally labor support for their campaigns for the initiative and referendum. The Direct Legislation League of New Jersey publicly acknowledged this assistance. A most valuable aid to the league has been the action of the labor organizations. A number of the local unions sufficient to show that the opinion is general if not unanimous have formally approved the league's principles. Among the other central bodies taking such action are the Essex Trad S Council, the State Typographical Union, and the New Jersey branch of the American Federation of Labor. Much is due to J.P. McDonnell of the Patterson Labor Standard and John G. McCormick of the Trenton Potters Journal for the instructions their papers have given on the subject. 16. Next to Sullivan, the most active labor figure in the movement for direct legislation was Henry Sterling, a member of the International Typographical Union's Boston Local. In January 1900, Sterling read a paper on direct legislation at a meeting of the Boston Central Labor Union, and in the same year, he became chairman of the Joint Committee for Direct Legislation of the Boston Central Labor Union, the Building Trades Council, and the Massachusetts State Federation of Labor. In that capacity, Sterling sent thousands of letters and petitions on direct legislation to trade unions all over the country, to unify the union sentiment in favor of the measure. In the labor union, he declared, lies the latent potential power to secure the adoption of direct legislation in 3/4 of the states in the union. Under Sterling's FORE career of J. P. McDonnell, socialist editor of the Patterson Labor Standard, c. Foner, Op. Cit. Volume 2, pp. 30-31. Leadership. The Massachusetts State Federation of Labor instituted in 1901 the practice of obtaining pledges from candidates for the state legislature on direct legislation. Organized labor declared a letter sent by the Federation's committee headed by Sterling, as very earnest in urging that the legislature submit the measure to a vote of the people. In your district are many trade unionists, and we respectfully but urgently request that you state your position on the matter in order that we may inform our members. 17. In 1894, the AFL unions in Los Angeles raised the demand for the initiative and referendum among a series of proposals they wished to see incorporated in a new city charter. In 1902, largely as a result of continual pressure from organized labor through the Los Angeles Council of Labor and its representatives in the Los Angeles Direct Legislation League, Los Angeles became the first city in the country to provide the recourse of direct legislation. 18. The initiative and referendum were the subject of frequent debates and resolutions at the annual AFL conventions. At the 1901 session, Gompers analyzed the reasons that impelled labor's interest in direct legislation. He pointed out that under the boss and machine domination of government in the interests of big business, labor was unable to secure legislation it desired or defeat bills which were aimed against it, so that we workers may have an opportunity of petitioning for favorable or vetoing vicious legislation, are some of the causes upon which the American Federation of Labor predicates its demand for direct legislation for initiative and referendum. 19** at its next convention, a resolution was adopted which stressed the need for an increase of power in voters, to be attained by the adoption of the referendum and initiative. 20. Special attention was directed to the manner in which the referendum had been secured in Winnetka, Illinois, and it was recommended that the same procedure be followed throughout the country. The Winnetka system, called the Rule of Procedure Systems, provided for the adoption of direct legislation without any change in the written constitution of the state or of the city charter by the passage of a bill by the municipal government. The referendum had been instituted by the labor. Although Gompers favored the use of the referendum in the political arena, he ceased to advocate its use in the trade unions. In 1897, he had recommended that AFL officers be elected by referendum, as they were in the Cigar Makers International Union, but in 1900, when Max Hayes, the socialist delegate of the Cleveland Federation of Labor, introduced a resolution calling for election by referendum, Gompers opposed it in debate and vote and helped secure its defeat. Evidently it was necessary to use the referendum to defeat machine domination of government, but its use to defeat machine domination of the AFL was quite another matter. See Proceedings, AFL Convention, 1900, pp. 13-16, 32-35. Unions of Winnetka by questioning candidates for mayor and alderman as to where they stood on the issue, and then supporting those who pledged to advocate the measure when in office. The plan was enthusiastically endorsed by the AFL, and a special issue of the American Federationist was published in January 1902, describing the Winnetka system in detail, accompanied by an address suggesting a similar procedure for the trade unions in all municipalities. The special issue was distributed to AFL affiliates throughout the country. From 1902 through 1903, the unions, in cooperation with reform bodies, conducted vigorous campaigns in all cities throughout the country and in Canada along the lines of the Winnetka system. By the end of 1903, direct legislation including, in many cases, the initiative and referendum had been adopted in Detroit, Buffalo, Waco, Texas, Toronto, and a score or more of other cities. 21. Meanwhile, the various state federations of labor were conducting statewide campaigns to give the people of the various states an opportunity to vote on a constitutional amendment for the initiative and referendum. In Missouri, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Texas, Illinois, Kansas, Michigan, and other states, the trade unions were active, in conjunction with direct legislation leagues, in questioning candidates for the legislatures as to their position on direct legislation. In Missouri, the campaign was especially effective. A leader of the Missouri Direct Legislation League reported, "The labor unions are very strong and influential here and support our movement to a man. They are a unit in our favor. They are all pledged to the initiative and referendum and are exceedingly eager to secure it. They will question candidates to the legislature if they will use their influence and vote for the direct legislation amendment. 22. Having secured the adoption of constitutional amendments incorporating direct legislation in several states, organized labor turned to the national legislative scene. In 1904, the AFL and the National Grange jointly sponsored a national program for the initiative and referendum which called for the questioning of candidates for Congress as to whether or not, if elected, they would vote to install the system in the national government. The program, proposing the adoption of the initiative and referendum by Congress, opened with a statement citing the need for it in the United States. That the few are the ruling power in this country is evidenced by the enacted laws which grant special privileges. One form of these is private monopolies in transportation, such as railroads and the telegraphs, and private monopolies in raw materials, such as coal, iron, salt, etc., and private monopolies in manufacture and trade secured through the monopolies in transportation and raw materials. So rapid is the increase in the monopolies in raw material and transportation rates that if the system continues a while longer it will result in monopoly in every line of manufacture and trade. The remedy of the rule of the corporations is for the people to guard their sovereignty by establishing a right to a direct vote on public questions through the initiative and referendum. Recognizing that an act of Congress providing for a general initiative and referendum would be unconstitutional, the AFL proposed a plan which provided for the advisory initiative and referendum, until the people take to themselves the final power in legislation by a constitutional amendment for the optional referendum and direct initiative. The proposal took the form of a resolution to be adopted by both houses of Congress's Rules of Procedure. This resolution provided that whenever 75,000 voters presented to the House and the Senate any bill, constitutional amendment, or other form of question as to national policy regarding interstate commerce or 10 other areas of national policy, the petition had to be received, read twice, referred to a committee for consideration, and reported back, together with such amendments, substitutes, or recommendations as were deemed desirable. The House, after considering the subject and agreeing with the Senate, but without an enacting clause, would refer the original bill as initiated to the voters, and also such alternative measure or recommendation as had been agreed upon. If, in a majority of the congressional districts and a majority of the states, a majority of the votes should be cast for the measure, an enacting clause would be incorporated and a vote upon it taken in Congress. Each measure initiated by petitions was to have precedence over all other measures, except appropriation bills and bills immediately necessary for the preservation of the public peace, health, or safety. It was to be reported to the Speaker of the House for submission not later than 1 year from the time it was filed. The resolution for an advisory referendum on laws of Congress and measures passed by a House or both Houses also provided that whenever the term, national policy concerning interstate commerce, was defined as follows. That is concerning railways, telegraphs, telephones, currency, or other instrument of interstate commerce, or a corporation or individual whose business it is to operate any of the instruments of interstate commerce. The 10 other areas of national policy were trial by jury or any modification of the law of injunction, 2. Dependencies, 3. Hours and conditions of labor, 4. Immigration, 5. Postal Savings Bank, 6. Direct election of senators, President and Vice President of the United States, 7. The civil service, including the election of fourth-class postmasters, 8. Direct nominations, 9. Direct initiative and optional referendum, and 10. Proportional representation. 500,000 voters requested it in writing. Such laws or measures would be submitted to a vote of the people for the purpose of instructing their representatives. The balloting was to take place not later than the following general election occurring more than 60 days after the filing of the petition. 23. Gompers was convinced that neither the advisory initiative nor the advisory referendum was in conflict with any part of the United States Constitution. As he saw it, they were simply regulations setting forth how a certain class of petitions to Congress might be inaugurated, filed, and considered by Congress, then referred to an advisory vote of the people through the machinery of the referendum. He conceded that the will of the people as expressed through such an advisory vote would not be binding on the members of Congress, but he believed that they would feel a moral obligation not to depart from it. Gompers was certain, and rather naively so, that this moral obligation would make the system effective. 24. Various state federations of labor and state branches, especially those in Missouri, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, promoted the campaign for the advisory initiative and referendum on congressional legislation. Speaking to the 1905 AFL convention, Gompers reported, "Success has crowned the action of the State Federation of Missouri." 9 of the 16 congressmen elected answered in the affirmative, and in writing, as also did the newly elected Missouri senator. In Illinois, the newly elected senator, in a letter, gave this pledge: "I favor any principle, I care not what it may be called, that enlarges the power of the people on all questions, state and national, that affects the well-being of citizens." 25. Although the national campaign was not successful, it helped popularize the demand for the initiative and referendum. By this time, that demand had become a key issue in the nationwide, progressive revolt. But it was organized labor that first raised it. As far back as 1894. Gompers had declared that, all lovers of the human family, all who earnestly strive for political reform, economic justice, and social enfranchisement must range themselves on the side of organized labor in this demand for direct legislation. 26. The adoption of the initiative and referendum in many communities throughout the country was the result of just such an alliance of organized labor and other progressive forces. To be sure, the triumph of the initiative and referendum in these by 1912, the initiative and referendum had been adopted in South Dakota, Utah, Oregon, Montana, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Colorado, Arizona, California, Washington, Nebraska, Idaho, and Ohio. Charles A. Beard, Contemporary American History, 1877 to 1913, New York, 1917, pp. 284-86. Communities did not bring with it, as some of the labor advocates of direct legislation had predicted, the solution of most of the problems facing the American people. Nonetheless, it was an important step forward in American democracy, and labor's contribution to its realization was truly a significant one. Labor and the recall. Organized labor also played a significant role in initiating and advancing the movement for recall of elected officials. This progressive demand first appeared in the Los Angeles City Charter of 1903 as a result of several years of agitation led by the Los Angeles Council of Labor. In 1898 and 1900, the Council of Labor and the Socialist Party of the city worked together to nominate members of the Board of Freeholders who would pledge themselves to incorporate the initiative and referendum and recall in the proposed instrument. The board was charged with the responsibility of writing a new city charter. In 1902, the Council of Labor and its spokesman, Dr. John R. Haynes, head of the Los Angeles Direct Legislation League were successful in having the Charter Revision Committee incorporate proposals for the initiative, referendum and recall. With the help of the Los Angeles Union Labor Party, the only political party in the city to espouse direct legislation, the Friends of Direct Legislation won a signal triumph in the 1902 charter election. Despite the cry of conservatives that the recall was revolutionary, Los Angeles adopted the charter by a huge majority, including the amendments providing for direct legislation. In January 1903, the California legislature approved the amendments to the Los Angeles City Charter. The action represented a triumph for the California State Federation of Labor and the Direct Legislation League, which worked together to achieve it. 27. A year later, the nation's attention was focused on the movement in Los Angeles to recall a member of the city council, a campaign in which organized labor played a decisive role. The Los Angeles City Council voted to give the city's printing charter to the highest bidder, the Los Angeles Times, spearhead of the open shop throughout the West Coast and a bitter foe of organized labor in general and of the typographical union in particular. The cry of recall immediately went up, and J. P. Davenport, one of the councilmen who had voted for the award, was selected for a test action. The typographical union led the campaign for Davenport's recall. Its members in his ward, the 6th, started the move. To secure signatures for this purpose, it is fitting, notes Grace H. Stimson, that a trade union was in the forefront of a movement to make practical application of a charter provision which organized labor had itself helped to promote. 28. This was the first recall petition ever circulated in the United States. 29. When the necessary number of signatures had been obtained, the city council set the recall election. Dr. Arthur D. Houghton was selected as the candidate to oppose Davenport in the recall election. Davenport made several frantic efforts to prevent the election through court intervention, but, after a few early victories, the final decision went against him. During the campaign, the Los Angeles Times and the Daily Journal, the two most powerful papers in the city, the street railway companies, the gas company, the liquor interests, the Republican Party, and the property owners and businessmen of the 6th Ward all supported Davenport. The trade unions, assisted by the Direct Legislation League, the Good Government League, and several smaller newspapers campaigned for Dr. Houghton. The pro-Davenport forces made trade unionism the issue. The Daily Journal cried out on September 15, 1904, "The man who votes tomorrow against J. P. Davenport votes for the supremacy and arrogance of labor unionism in Los Angeles." Like a snake, it is hiding in the grass because the people of Los Angeles have such a hearty contempt for its vile practices that only by dissembling and masking its real purpose can it hope to gain a point. Houghton defeated Davenport by a vote of 183-7 to 1083, carrying all but one of the 16 precincts in the 6th Ward, including Davenport's own precinct. The results of yesterday's election in the 6th Ward, wailed the Los Angeles Times on September 17, is nothing short of a disgrace to the ward and an affront to the city at large. This lament from the arch foe of organized labor and other progressive forces was enough to verify the significance of the election result. The effect was tremendous. Dr. Stimson writes, "The recall election on September 16, 1904 made not only local but national political history. For the first time in the United States a public official was recalled from office by vote of the people." Houghton's backers readily give credit for the victory to the labor unions, which had planned and carried out a systematic campaign. The success of the movement to recall Davenport greatly enhanced the popularity of direct legislation. Within several years a number of communities in California had written the initiative, referendum and recall into their charters, and cities in other states were beginning to take note of these democratic processes. In Los Angeles, proponents of better government found that the mere threat of recall was sufficient to deter councilmen from voting for unpopular measures. After the Davenport affair, two of the other city legislators who had awarded the printing contract to the Times were defeated when they sought renomination. Most pleasing to the Unionists who had worked indefatigably in the recall campaign, however, was the failure of the Times to win later city contracts. In 1905, the council with little discussion simply awarded the contract to the lowest bidder, and through the rest of the decade the Times was unable to influence the council in its behalf. 30. In 1910 and 1911, the recall issue again aroused nationwide interest, and once again organized labor played an important part in the movement. On June 16, 1910, Congress passed an act to enable the territories of Arizona and New Mexico to form constitutions and state governments. Constitutional conventions were to meet in the two territories in the fall of 1910 to draw up constitutions for the states. The New Mexico Convention, dominated by conservative elements, drew up a conservative organic instrument of government. However, the situation in Arizona was different. There, the trade unions spearheaded the movement for a progressive constitution. On July 13, 1910, the Arizona Republican featured the following announcement. Representatives of the workingmen's unions in Arizona, in convention in Phoenix yesterday, labored and brought forth a new political party, and named it the Labor Party of Arizona. The following day, the Arizona Republican carried the text of a telegram sent to Gompers by J. C. Provost, head of the convention which had organized the Labor Party. The Labor Party of Arizona extends its appeal for aid to the American Federation of Labor in this campaign for a working-class constitution, regardless of the attitude of the Federation officials who still expect us to accept promises of those old-line party politicians by whom labor has been repeatedly betrayed. Enlightened labor has gone into this campaign in its own behalf and in its own interest. The unions, led by the Typographical Union, the Western Federation of Miners, the Blacksmiths Union, and the Carpenters and Joiners Union, had organized the Labor Party of Arizona for the express purpose of electing progressive candidates to the Constitutional Convention. 31 Its Declaration of Principles stated, "We, the representatives of labor of the territory of Arizona in conference assembled, in order to secure and perpetuate the blessing of liberty, to secure just and rightful government, and to promote our mutual welfare and happiness, hereby declare and affirm that we have organized ourselves into the Labor Party of Arizona, and do ordain and establish the following code of principles and platform, and that we further demand their incorporation in the Constitution of the State of Arizona. All political power is inherent in the people and government is instituted for their protection, security and benefit, and they have the right to alter or reform the same whenever the public good may require it. As measures to strengthen labor in its struggle for better conditions, we advocate and pledge ourselves and our elected delegates to the Constitutional Convention to the following program. 32. 27 demands were included in the Labor Party's program, and they merit listing here, since they represented the most advanced platform of the entire progressive movement. 1. The initiative, referendum, and right of recall. 2. Universal and equal male and female suffrage. 3. A maximum workday of 8 hours. 4. Election of United States Senators by popular vote. 5. 2-year terms for all state, county, and municipal officers. 6. The right of the state to engage in industrial pursuits. 7. A law to end the abuse of the injunction. 8. Government by enacted law. 9. The state to defray the expense for the defense in criminal cases as well as for the prosecution. 10. An employer's liability law. 11. The power to declare laws unconstitutional to reside only in the people by referendum vote. 12. Abolition of the fee system in all courts. 13. A child and female labor law restricting the hours and conditions of employment. 14. Requirement of 6 months residence to qualify citizens to become voters. 15. No private detectives or police to be permitted to give testimony. 16. No law to be passed in any way limiting the franchise of the citizens, nor any fee system to be permitted in the registration, primary, or election laws. 17. The amendment of the Constitution only by a majority vote of the electors on the initiative of the legislators or the people. 18. An honest registration law. 19. The secret ballot. 20. The direct primary. 21. A thoroughgoing and effective Corrupt Practices Act, including publishing of campaign funds and contributions before elections. 22. A state-guaranteed banking law. 23. A state industrial commission with qualified inspectors for each industry. 24. The absolute freedom of speech, press, and peaceable assemblage. 25. Exclusion of measures passed by the referendum from the governor's power of veto. 26. No competitive convict labor. And 27. Compulsory education to the age of 16.33. Labor Party busy at work, read a headline in the Arizona Republican of July 19, 1910. The party nominated a ticket composed of 21 candidates, 18 of whom were members of the Democratic Party and had pledged to support the Labor Party's program, while 3 were independents. 34 In the campaign to elect its delegates to the Constitutional Convention, the Labor Party organized committees in each county, held meetings in union halls and at social gatherings, and distributed pamphlets and leaflets throughout the territory. In its leaflet addressed to the farmer, the Labor Party urged the farmer to align yourself with labor from all the industries. Join it hand to hand and get back control of your government through the initiative, referendum and recall. have incorporated in the Constitution such provisions as will give you control over your lawmaking and judicial representatives. 35. On September 12, 1910, Arizona voted overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidates to the Constitutional Convention, many of whom had pledged to support the key demands in the Labor Party's platform, and all of whom were advocates of the initiative, referendum, and recall. The Arizona Republican acknowledged that the aggressive campaign waged by the Labor Party had played a large part in the Democratic victory. 36. It even characterized the Constitutional Convention as a gathering in the interest of labor. 37. This was not an exaggeration. The convention was controlled by pro-labor delegates, all of whom were advocates of direct legislation and social legislation for labor. With 4 men out of the 5 of the Committee on Labor carrying Union cards, the Arizona Republican commented on October 14, 1910, "It is probable that labor will get an even break." The convention produced a constitution that was extremely progressive and especially friendly to labor. It contained provisions for the initiative, referendum, and recall, including the recall of judges, for the 8-hour day, regulation of employment of children and women, provisions for safety of workers in hazardous occupations, an employer's liability law, and the abolition of convict labor. These things, the Labor Party declared in endorsing the Constitution, should commend it to all those who believe with Lincoln that labor is superior to capital and that people are of more importance than property. 38. Despite the threat of congressional and presidential disapproval of the proposed Constitution, the people of Arizona voted overwhelmingly on February 9, 1911 to accept the document as written. The instrument thereupon went to Congress, where the inclusion of the recall of elected officials immediately provoked a heated dispute. The conservatives in Congress and President Taft asserted that they were ready to accept the Arizona document provided that the recall features did not apply to asterisk. In his first annual message to Congress, President Abraham Lincoln declared in part, "Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor, and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital, and deserves much the higher consideration." Philip S. Foner, editor, Abraham Lincoln. Selections from his writings, New York, 1944, page 82. Judges. The Progressives, pointing out that this demand was especially important to labor as a result of its experiences under the Sherman Act, asterisk took up the cudgels for the Constitution as adopted by the people of Arizona. 39. Organized labor in many cities petitioned Congress to adopt the Arizona Constitution without any change. An especially effective campaign along this line was conducted by the labor movement in Ohio. Since delegates to a constitutional convention were scheduled to be elected in the fall of 1911 to draw up a new constitution for Ohio, the trade unions and progressive reformers believed that if Arizona's constitution was approved by Congress, it would help the movement to incorporate the initiative, referendum, and recall in the new constitution for Ohio. 40. In May 1911, the Arizona Constitutional Petition League of Typographical Union No. 63 of Toledo, Ohio was organized. It sponsored a petition to be presented to Congress calling for the approval and adoption of the Arizona Constitution as passed by its people on the ground that they only have the right to decide upon a constitution under which they are to govern themselves. The petition movement gained the support of all the unions in Toledo as well as of the Central Labor Council. Thousands of signatures were obtained to the petition, which was presented to Congress on June 28, 1911. In addition, the Ohio State Federation of Labor, the Ohio State Grange, and the Ohio Direct Legislation League united to support the petition movement. As a result, petitions were sent from various parts of Ohio to Congress in favor of the Arizona Constitution. 41. The bill providing for Arizona's admission as a state passed Congress on August 11, 1911 but was vetoed 4 days later by President Taft because of the inclusion of the recall of judges provision. Immediately, the trade unions in various parts of the country petitioned Congress, demanding that the bill be passed over Taft's veto. 42. Meanwhile, a compromise was worked out under which Arizona would withdraw the obnoxious provision from its constitution with the understanding that it would restore it once it became a state. On this basis, Taft signed the bill and Arizona became a state. Shortly thereafter, the recall of judges provision was incorporated as part of Arizona's constitution. Never before has organized labor been so successful in creating public. The Sherman Anti-Trust Act of 1890 stipulated that combinations in the form of a trust, or otherwise, acting in restraint of interstate commerce, were illegal. Court decisions included organized labor among the, or otherwise, and held that unions were liable under the Sherman Act. Opinion Is Now, a contemporary labor paper, boasted joyfully as it noted the successful conclusion of the battle for the inclusion of the recall provision in Arizona's Constitution. 43. Arizona was not the only territory to be influenced by the progressive impulse. Oklahoma, which achieved statehood just as the progressive era was gathering momentum, became a laboratory for progressive experimentation. On June 16, 1906, President Roosevelt signed an enabling act to admit Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory to the Union as one state. An election was to be held on November 4, 1906 to elect 112 delegates to a convention which would write a constitution for the new state. Oklahoma thus had an opportunity to write a constitution which would reflect the chief planks of the progressive program. An alliance of organized labor, farmers, and social reformers set out to do precisely that. Although it was largely agricultural at this time, Oklahoma did possess an extensive body of organized labor. In 1907, there were over 21,000 Unionists in 303 unions. Of this number, 1/3 were miners in coalfields in the western part of the state. Other large bodies of organized workers were in the railroad brotherhoods and the construction trades. 44 The Twin Territories Federation of Labor, composed of AFL unions, was organized in 1903 and worked closely with the railroad brotherhoods and the Farmers' Educational and Cooperative Union of America, popularly referred to as the Farmers' Union. 45 These three forces joined in the drive for a progressive state constitution. They were joined by Oklahoma's leading social reformer, Kate Barnard, a young Catholic social worker from Oklahoma City, who had become convinced that the only way to eliminate poverty and achieve social justice was through the organization of labor and the use of union-made products. Barnard formed and became secretary of the Oklahoma chapter of the Women's International Union Label League. In January 1907, she also founded Federal Union No. 12374 for unskilled laborers in Oklahoma City and was elected its representative to the Oklahoma City Trades and Labor Assembly. As a member of both the Trades Assembly and the Farmers Union, Barnard became an important force in the labor-farmer social reformer campaign to gain control of the Constitutional Convention and write a progressive state constitution. 46. The delegates to the Oklahoma Constitutional Convention met from November 20, 1906 to March 15, 1907. The majority were members of *. The League began in Muncie, Indiana early in 1899 and spread into many communities. It sought to educate women buyers to purchase only products carrying union labels. The Unionist Farmer Social Reformer Coalition. The convention wrote a document described by Samuel Gompers as the most progressive constitution now existing on the American continent. On September 17, 1907, the people of the Twin Territories overwhelmingly accepted the Constitution. Reflecting the prevailing progressive spirit, it included the initiative, referendum, recall, and the Australian ballot. But there were also specific gains won by the unions. The miners received an 8-hour day, an elected chief mine inspector, and the prohibition of the employment in the mines of girls, women, and boys under 16. All workers won a victory when the fellow servant doctrine was abrogated, when no limits were placed on damage suits resulting from industrial injuries, and when an elected commissioner of labor was authorized to inspect the railroads and other industries for safety hazards. The social reformers gained the demands urged by Kate Barnard. Prohibition of the use of convict lease labor and of the employment of children under 15 years of age in hazardous occupations, and the establishment of compulsory education. Thus, while the Western radical agrarians were mobilizing their forces behind the movement for greater democracy, organized labor was conducting a similar drive in various communities throughout the country. Certainly as far as direct legislation not normally considered part of labor's demands was concerned, the Australian ballot, the initiative, referendum, and recall, it was organized labor that provided the initial impetus and the major sustaining drive behind the movement. But in several states, organized labor in alliance with the social progressives was also able to win victories for specific, bread and butter, reforms of the progressive movement from which all workers, organized and unorganized, benefited. The fellow servant rule prevented recovery by an injured employee who had knowledge of the danger which led to his injury. The employee's fear of losing his job because of refusal to work on a dangerous machine or in the face of other hazards did not matter. In a decision handed down in England, the doctrine was set down that a master is entitled to carry on his business in a dangerous way, if the servant is foolish enough to agree to it. C. B. Labatt, Commentaries on the Law of Masters and Servants, Rochester, N. Y. 1904, p. 62. CHAPTER 3. Labor and the Progressive Movement. 2. In analyzing the political activities of organized labor, historians have traditionally concentrated on the role of national bodies, such as the AFL, to which they have devoted most of their attention in discussing labor's attitude toward various presidential candidates. An analysis of organized labor's participation in municipal politics is essential in order to round out the picture of its political activities. This is especially true of the progressive era. Labor and municipal reform. During the 1820s and 1830s, when the American labor movement was in its infancy, several far-sighted individuals had stressed the importance of workers' participation in shaping the developing city governments along lines that would serve labor's needs. 1 But aside from leading the movement to institute the system of free public education, it was not until the beginning of the 20th century that organized labor paid any considerable attention to the character of city government. To the degree that labor was interested in political issues, its eyes were focused mainly on national affairs. Except for the Union Labor Party movement in New York City, which ran Henry George for mayor in 1886, and similar developments in other cities at that time, organized labor did not concern itself to any great extent with municipal problems. In 1902, the Connecticut State Federation of Labor called upon the C. Foner, Op. Cit. Vol. I. pp. 86, 123, 216-17, 247. C. Ibid. Vol. 2, pp. 119-31, 148-56. Trade unions in every municipality to play an active role in the various reform movements aimed at ending boss domination of city governments. Organized labor holds the balance of voting power in nearly all the cities and should exercise it. When its appeal point to the response was not enthusiastic. In the eyes of most workers, government by reformers was hardly any improvement over government by corrupt boss and machine, and in some ways it was worse. They had sound and compelling reasons for this feeling. 1. There were actually two groups of reformers in the progressive movement: civic reformers and social reformers. The former emphasized honest, efficient government and were indifferent to the social injustices of industrialized America, while the social reformers, backed by consumers' leagues, campaigned to end social injustice through social reform measures aimed at ending the specific conditions which produced poverty, ill health, or the demoralization of the working woman. In most cities, the reform movement was headed by the civic reformers who came from the wealthy so-called respectable elements of society. Their objective was to purify city government, end graft, replace corrupt officials with good men, and institute honest, efficient, businesslike city government. These reformers, however, either refused or failed to recognize that the corrupt politicians were bribed by wealthy businessmen, particularly the seekers of public utility franchises. Behind the corrupt bosses were the real forces responsible for the evils the reformers were supposed to be combating. But since many of the respectable elements wanted special privileges from government themselves, they were not inclined to expose this connection. Indeed, it was not unusual to find that when reformers replaced corrupt officials with good men, all that happened was that the most flagrant types of graft were replaced by a more subtle and infinitely more important species of corruption, namely, the tendency of the good men, once in office, to serve the business interests from which they themselves came, regardless of the interests of the people as a whole. Some of the worst franchise grabs in the history of municipal governments were engineered by good city officials who had ousted the more disreputable grafters in a reform uprising. 3. It often turned out that the same men who were responsible for corruption were behind the reform forces. As Gustavus Myers wrote in 1910, this movement was nicknamed Goo-Goo for good government, and its enthusiastic supporters, mostly the respectable elements, were called Goo-Goos. The very men who cheated cities, states and nation out of enormous sums in taxation, who bribed, through their retainers, legislatures, common councils and executive and administrative officials, who corruptly put judges on the bench, who made government simply an auxiliary to their designs, who exacted tribute from the people in 1,000 ways, who forced their employees to work for precarious wages and who bitterly fought every movement for the betterment of the working classes. These were the men who made up those so-called reform committees just as today they constitute them. If there had been the slightest serious attempt to interfere with their vested privileges, corruptly obtained and corruptly enhanced, and with the vast amount of increment and graft that these privileges brought them, they would have instantly raised the cry of revolutionary confiscation. But they were very willing to put an end to the petty graft which the politicians collected from saloons, brothels, peddlers, and the small merchants. 42. The outlook of many reformers rarely extended beyond the needs of the upper and middle classes. In 1911, Charles Zero Pratt, the transit workers' spokesman in Philadelphia, rejected an appeal for support from the wealthy reformer, Rudolph Blankberg, who was running for mayor, on the ground that the best that oppressed Philadelphia can expect from your hand in the way of reform would be an academic, perfectly polite dilettante expression of the vital city problems, with municipal action directed at the sinful or weak poor, and complete protection afforded the sinful and powerful rich. 5. This judgment was based on past experience with reformers, who ignored the needs of the great mass of the laboring classes, particularly the daily problems with which the workers were preoccupied. Thus, the respectable elements never understood the needs and problems of the new immigrants who were becoming members of the community in increasing numbers. The machine bosses, through their ward heelas, took special pains to win the support of these immigrants, guiding them through the early confusing days of house and job hunting, advising and encouraging them, helping them in time of stress, offering them camaraderie in their social clubs, participating in their family celebrations or funerals, and hastening them through the naturalization procedure all to gain their votes. One commentator observed, "The Tammany workers were big brother, little sister, and general fixer to their slum constituents. To them the poor looked for jobs as watchmen, laborers, and chauffeurs, for permits to sell newspapers, black boots, roast peanuts or keep chickens, for assistance in gaining admission to hospitals, for intercession with the landlord when the rent was overdue, for passing the hat to save the destitute from Potter's Field, or for intervention in the courts when a youth had run afoul of the law. 6. As John D. Buneker has demonstrated, some middle-class reformers did seek to serve the needs of the immigrant working class and did win their votes as a result, but all too often reformers made no effort in this direction. On the contrary, they dismissed the immigrants as tools of the machine bosses and blamed the corrupt state of municipal government on the increasing flow of foreign-born workers into the cities. Amos Pinchot, one of the few reformers who recognized that the boss and the machine gained a great deal of their power through their social and human functions, wrote, "So long as we reformers refuse to attack the sources of Tammany's power, Tammany is perhaps a little bored with us, but, on the whole, the tiger feels safe and happy." 7. Another example of the failure of the reformers to understand the needs of the working people, and of their indifference to these needs, was the stress they placed on getting rid of the saloon. Indeed, the Sunday saloon closing movement became a key issue for many reformers, and they devoted much of their time to seeking to enforce laws for this purpose. To be sure, some union organizers and officers also opposed the saloon, fearing the dulling effect of alcohol on working-class consciousness. At the 1909 AFL convention, Gompers declared, "The time has come when the saloon and the labor movement must be divorced." Nevertheless, union members were overwhelmingly against prohibition, partly because it would deprive thousands of union men of their jobs, and partly because they felt it discriminated against the poor, since the rich would always be able to obtain all the liquor they wanted. But a major reason was that the saloon was the poor man's club, and that the alcohol it dispensed was only a part of the role it played in working class and immigrant cultures. The reformers, however, showed no understanding of the social function of the saloon in the lives of the workers. They never bothered to ask if the miserable shack or tenement that a worker called home was the place where he wanted to spend his Sundays. Nor were they interested in the fact that for tired toilers, too poor to pay for any other form of social life, the IWW took the same position. "We are out to make the workers think," insisted the industrial worker, "and we think that sober men think better than drunkards." Wobblies closed down saloons, often by force, especially during strikes. Coyce L. Kornblue, Rebel, Voices. An I.W. W. Anthology, Ann Arbor, Michigan, 1964, pp. 257-58, 270-71, Ronald M. Benson, Sober Workman, unpublished paper delivered at Organization of American Historians, April 11-14, 1979, pp. 10-11. Other advocates of temperance in labor circles during this period included Warren Stone of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, L.E. Shepard of the Conductors, D. B. Robertson of the Locomotive Firemen, John Mitchell of the United Mine Workers, and John B. Lennon, AFL Treasurer. The saloon offered relief from the monotony and agony of everyday existence. "The saloon exists in our town," wrote one worker, "because it supplies a want and need. It offers a common meeting place. It dispenses good cheer. It ministers to the craving for fellowship. To the exhausted, worn-out body, to the strained nerves, the relaxation brings rest. Brand Whitlock, the Ohio Progressive, pointed out, the saloon is a part of our whole economic system, and the only way to get rid of the saloon is to reform economic conditions. The saloon gratifies not only what our economic conditions make a physical necessity, but it gratifies also what our economic conditions make a social necessity. 9. But the respectable elements in the reform movement were themselves responsible for these economic conditions, and they were not interested in this logical approach to the problem of the saloon. Similarly, in their crusade against prostitution, these elements were not interested in the fact that the miserable wages they paid working girls forced many of them into a life of prostitution. Workers who led dull, monotonous lives at the machine and came home to miserable hovels were starved for amusement and entertainment. The churches, the schools, and the libraries failed to meet this problem. The machine bosses stepped into the breach with processions, picnics, and other forms of entertainment. The reformers sneered, but they did nothing to meet the needs of the working people. As the Philadelphia Press pointed out in 1902, politicians owe no small share of their power to the various means through which they supply these lacking needs of the working people. Reform will always be at a disadvantage in its contest with the machine until it realizes that the city itself ought to furnish many of these needs. While the politician meets this need, he will always have the advantage over a program of city reform which consists of nothing more than closing down saloons and houses of prostitution, reducing the illicit vote, and convicting repeaters and bribe takers. Reform must beat the politician on his own grounds by adding to all asterisk, what is the relation between insufficient wages and the victims of the red light district? Mary E. McDowell asked in 1908. And she answered, it is the aid to wages which is got from this oldest trade in the world. On March 18, 1913, Ms. McDowell wrote to Julius Rosenwald, head of Sears and Roebuck, it is time to change the public mind from the vice question to the real, fundamental needs of the thousands of helpless girls, 823 of whom are actually helping to maintain their families. Mary E. McDowell. Papers, Chicago Historical Society, Ms. McDowell sharply criticized Rosenwald for his statement before the State White Slave Commission, in which he said flatly that low wages have no connection with prostitution. Acting Governor Barat O'Hara agreed with McDowell. He pointed out that the commission had demonstrated that more than 60,000 women in Chicago were receiving $5 or less per week, were absolutely underfed, and never had a full meal. Is it any wonder women do wrong? He asked. New York Call. March 8, 1913. This, public baths in every ward, gymnasiums for youths and adults of both sexes, public bakeries, a supply of hot water and facilities for washing which bathhouses can give, music in every square through the summer, more parks and more recreation in them, lectures in school rooms now empty, concerts and opportunities for feeling the color and light which there is in life, in art, in social contact and knowledge. Until these come and are made a part of the reform civic program, the politician will be at an advantage in corruptly furnishing what the people want because we do not have a reform movement under which the municipality will furnish it honestly. 103. Many reformers were not interested in including labor in the alliance of the groups that made up the reform movement. Go to the people with your program, Lincoln Steffens urged the reformers. Be sure to appeal especially to the plain people. 11. Frank Moss, in a speech entitled, A Basis for Municipal Reform, delivered in 1902, voiced the same appeal when he said, the basis for municipal reform must be found in winning the patriotism and appealing to the ideals of the great laboring element in our midst, in enlisting the plain people, in obtaining the cooperation of the trade unions. You will never beat the corruptionists by banding together only the so-called better classes, the church members and church workers, and going to the polls with that backing alone. 4 years later, a group of Chicago municipal reformers conceded that winning labor's support was the key to victory for their cause. If we can get the labor men with us as they ought to be, we will sweep the city and forever silence the corrupt opposition. 12. But the better classes were not interested in having organized labor as an ally. Even many of the muckrakers, much as they wanted to end corruption in American life, were frightened by the prospect of an alliance with organized labor to accomplish this, and they were especially alarmed at the prospect of uniting with the more militant elements in the labor movement. In the minds of most middle and upper-class reformers, militant unionism meant mob violence and in many respects was a greater danger to the nation than the trusts. There was continual talk among the reformers of protecting the public interest from both the unions and the trusts. 13. Then again, the respectable reformers were not eager to give the unions and their leaders respectable status by accepting them into the civic reform fold. meant, who were speaking out in favor of more efficient city government in which laws would be enforced, did not themselves obey the laws against foul conditions in the tenements and factories which they owned. Why the reformers, who spoke out so heatedly against houses of prostitution, did nothing to raise the wages of the working girls who were compelled to supplement their meager earnings with a life of vice just in order to make ends meet. Why the reformers did not demand that the Sunday closing law be enforced against the clubs for the wealthy, which were the gilded saloons of the rich, as well as against the corner saloons, and a host of similar questions. Small wonder, then, that many reformers showed little interest in following Stephen's and Moss's advice. We have already observed that in too many cities, corrupt trade union officials were often in the pay of politicians and were part of the established political machines. No appeals from reformers, no matter how concerned they may have been with labor's special problems, would have persuaded these officials to abandon their connections with the boss and the machine and join the reform cause. 14 Nevertheless, the absence of labor representation in many of the municipal reform movements was no indication of a lack of interest on the part of workers in ending boss rule of city governments. Indeed, in many cities where the reform movements advanced a program that was clearly in the interest of the working people and discarded the outlook which so often antagonized workers, organized labor played a vital role in them, even overruling the opposition of union officials tied to the machine. 15. In the early 1890s, the Detroit Trades Council and its affiliates vigorously supported Mayor Hazen Pingree, the first important progressive mayor in the country, in his battle for a municipal electric light plant, a 3-cent fare on the street railways, reduction of gas and telephone rates, and assistance to unemployed workers instead of imprisoning them as vagrants. In an article in the American Federationist of October, 1895, entitled, Detroit in the Van, J. W. Sullivan emphasized the role that the Detroit trade unions were playing in mobilizing public support for Pingree's progressive administration. He pointed out that the cost of lighting performed by the city was about half of that under private management, that gas had been brought down in price to 8 cents per 1,000 cubic feet, and that the 3-cent fare was providing workers with excellent transportation at the lowest cost in the country. All this, he declared, was a matter of financial interest to every working man. 16. Later, in Jersey City, the Council of Trades Unions and its affiliates were active in helping to secure the election in 1901, and the re-election for several terms thereafter, of Mark Fagan, a reform mayor. The trade unions backed him in his battle against the political bosses and the corporations, and helped him achieve his program for new schools, free baths and dispensaries, a modern park system, improved fire, health and street cleaning services, a progressive tax program under which corporations would pay their share of taxes, and municipal control of the street railways. 17. Labor and reform in Toledo. It was in two Ohio cities, Toledo and Cleveland, that great battles for progressive reform were waged, and there, too, organized labor was a potent force in the reform movements. Two factors are worth noting at the outset. 1. The leadership and rank and file of the labor movement in these cities were especially alert to the value of having progressive municipal government, and 2. The leaders of the reform movements, Golden Rule, Samuel M. Jones, Brand Whitlock, Tom L. Johnson, Newton D. Baker, Fred C. Howe, and Peter Witt believed in trade unionism and in the value of having organized labor's support in the battle for reform. T.S. In 1897, the 60 Toledo trade unions united to support Golden Rule, Samuel M. Jones for mayor. Although he ran on the Republican ticket, Jones was a liberal industrialist who had instituted the 8-hour day among drillers of his oil wells, and, as president of the Western Oil Men's Association, had gotten a resolution unanimously passed by the organization favoring the 8-hour day. This was probably the first organization of employers on record to take such a stand. Jones was a firm believer in trade unionism, although he felt that in its battle against the employers, organized labor should put its main stress on enlightening the majority of the population with respect to the moral evils inherent in the existing social and economic structure of society. Even before he became mayor, Jones antagonized the Republican machine by enthusiastically welcoming trade union support for his campaign, and, once in office, he infuriated the Republican boss by consulting trade. However, Jones was critical of unions which organized only skilled workers. He appealed to all unions to abandon all distinctions of skilled and unskilled in organizing. A few men are Skilled, for the simple reason that there is only opportunity for a few to be skilled, the great mass of the working world must forever remain common labor. The cause of labor as a unity is the cause of humanity as one. In the recognition of the principle of solidarity is the hope of labor, the hope of the nation and the hope of the human race. Samuel M. Jones to Gompers, June 2, 1900, AFL Corps. Union leaders rather than corporation spokesmen on the needs of the city. 19 Consequently, in the next election, the Republican machine demanded that Jones accept party dictation as a condition for being renominated to succeed himself. He refused, and ran instead on an independent ticket, sponsored by the trade unions of Toledo. An AFL spokesman wrote to Gompers from Toledo, "We are running Mayor Jones on an independent ticket, and he is going to poll more votes than the Republican and Democratic nominees for mayor. After we elect him, we are going after their nominees for governor. We are going to show them that labor cannot be turned down at will." Mayor Jones' platform is the AFL platform: equal rights to all, special privileges to none. He refused the Republican nomination when they asked him to pledge himself to the party and said that he would be mayor for all the people. These are the kind of men we have got to stand by. 20. Jones was re-elected mayor by a landslide in a campaign that was featured by attacks upon him as the candidate of the anarchist element in the city. 21 Thereupon, the trade unions turned their attention to the gubernatorial campaign. After both the Republican and Democratic parties had nominated reactionaries as their candidates for governor, the trade unions invited Mayor Jones to run as an independent campaign on a platform drawn up by the unions, which raised 5 demands. First, self-government through nomination of candidates by the people through the direct primary and direct making of laws by the people through the initiative and referendum. Second, public ownership of all public utilities. The extension of the principle now operating in the public ownership of the post office to the operation of mines, highways, steam and electric railroads, telegraphs, telephones and water and lighting plants. Third, union wages, hours and conditions are better for skilled labor, and an 8-hour day, with a living wage, for unskilled labor, on all public work. Fourth, abolition of the contract system, that glaring evil of the competitive system, on all public work, and the substitution of direct employment. Immediate cessation of the present system of exploiting prison labor for the benefit of the profit-mongers and to the injury of free labor. Fifth, it is the imperative duty of the state legislature to deal with the question of unemployment, to the end that provision may immediately be made that no citizen of Ohio, who is willing to work, shall be driven into pauperism, crime or insanity, for want of work. 22 Jones platform Cal Jed for public ownership of ALJ public utilities. 2. No granting of any new or extension of any existing franchises. 3. Abolition of the contract system of doing the work of city improvement. 4. Substitution of the day labor plan by a minimum wage of $1.50 for an 8-hour day. And 5. The employment of organized labor in all public work. Samuel Jones, The New Right, New York, 1899, p. 112. Jones accepted the invitation and a petition campaign was launched to place his name on the ballot. All 5 members of the committee which sponsored the petition were trade unionists, 3 were AFL officials and 2 were officers of the Railroad Brotherhoods. 23 An AFL leader wrote to Gompers from Toledo, "The independent movement has been launched. It is my firm belief that Jones will be elected, and should this prove true, what a triumph this would be for labor. I think it would be a good idea if you should run a notice in the next issue of the Federationist. Samuel M. Jones, candidate for governor. Independent ticket, upon the AFL platform. The unions and RR organizations have sponsored him, are endorsing and campaigning for him. 24. Asserting that there is no relief to the laborer in either old parties. Ohio unions enthusiastically endorsed Jones, and their members campaigned for him. 2's The Chicago Record reported. His UON's campaign workers are trade union volunteers. They talk from curbstones and speak on street corners. They hold meetings with working people during the noon hour and attend Republican and Democratic meetings to ask questions of the partisan speakers. The slogan of the Jones voters, heard from one end of Ohio to the other, is as follows. Rattle my bones over the stones. I'm only a voter whom nobody owns. And that is the reason I'm voting for Jones, 26. Although he had only a hastily prepared organization and the press was united in suppressing news of his comings and goings and in minimizing his campaign, 27 Jones made a respectable showing. He carried the two large cities of Toledo and Cleveland by sizable majorities. The organization which had sponsored and supported him in the gubernatorial campaign remained in existence after the election and was active in re-electing Jones when Herron again for mayor of Toledo in 1901 and 1903 on an independent ticket. 28. As mayor of Toledo until his death in 1904, Jones put in operation many of the demands raised by organized labor in the city. He established the 8-hour day and a minimum wage for city employees, introduced kindergartens and free concerts and opened public playgrounds, provided municipal work for the unemployed, vetoed the council's grant of renewal of the street railway franchise to a private corporation, took away clubs from the police and replaced them with canes, broke up the system of arresting on suspicion and holding those so arrested without charge, a practice which had been used effectively to break strikes, refused to help the street railway company in its efforts to break the union, and, by threatening to withhold police support to strikebreakers, helped the union maintain its organization and win a new agreement with improved conditions. 29. The era of Golden Rule, Jones in Toledo, characterized by the special role of organized labor in the reform movement, laid one of the foundations for the emerging progressive revolt. And upon Jones' death while still in office, organized labor, in unity with progressive reform forces, rallied behind Brand Whitlock, Jones' trusted legal advisor, and elected him mayor in November 1905 on a reform and anti-monopoly platform. 30. Immediately upon taking office, Whitlock took the canes away from the police and, as he wrote in 1910, since that time they have carried nothing in their white-gloved hands. 31. He also made it clear as soon as he assumed office that the police were not to be used to help the employers break strikes and that the mayor's office was not to be viewed as an agency of the open shop drive. In the Pope-Toledo automobile strike of 197, Whitlock let the company know that he did not intend to use the police department as a strike-breaking factor. 32. Whitlock fought the street railway company and, after a long, stubborn battle, extracted a lower fare and better operating conditions from management. He destroyed a scandalous ice monopoly perpetrated by a group of outstanding citizens. And he continued Jones' policy of establishing playgrounds, public baths, public concerts, and other social services. In 1907, Whitlock was re-elected mayor by a plurality of more than 6,500 votes. He gave credit to the working men for the victory. The feeling toward me of the working men, of the poor, of the outcast almost now brings tears to my eyes, he wrote directly after the election. 33. 2 years later, he was again elected in a campaign featured by the most bitter calumny heaped upon the reform administration by the conservative forces and by a vigorous campaign in its behalf by the labor forces in the city. 34. Labor and Reform in Cleveland. In January 1901, the United Trades and Labor Council of Cleveland distributed a petition among its affiliated unions urging the nomination of Tom L. Johnson as the Democratic candidate for mayor. Within a few days, thousands of trade unionists had signed the petition, and the sheets, added to the petitions distributed by other reform elements in the city, made up a mammoth roll. Johnson was nominated on a platform which was epitomized by the slogan, Home Rule, 3-cent fare, and just taxation. A key demand was for municipal ownership of all public utilities. 35. Like Golden Rule, Johnson was a successful businessman who had accumulated a substantial fortune before he joined the reform movement. He became a champion of Henry George's single tax program, took an active part in the United Labor Party's 1886 campaign to elect George mayor of New York, and studied the progressive reforms achieved in Detroit under Mayor Pingree, particularly the establishment of the 3-cent fare. He antagonized conservative industrialists who denounced him as a traitor to his class because he had aligned himself with the Labor Party in New York, and had defied the employers' associations by recognizing the unions and introducing higher wages and shorter working hours in the steel mills and on the street railways he owned. On February 2, 1901, the Cleveland Plain Dealer reported that Johnson was considered by the Chamber of Commerce as a dangerous candidate for mayor because the trade unions had participated actively in the petition movement to secure his nomination, and because of his popularity with his employees and with working men everywhere. In the campaign, Johnson defied the conservative business interests by coming out publicly in favor of union labor. If I were a laboring man, he declared, I should join a union. I believe in labor unions as a means of bringing together and uplifting the laboring classes. He denied that trade unions and trusts were identical, a common charge made by too many middle-class progressives. A man in a trust does not trust his partner, but the union men strike and starve together for their rights. 36 When the Republican candidate, in an effort to swing the labor vote, played up the fact that Johnson was a millionaire, a group of trade unionists, all of whom were Johnson's former employees, replied, "Whereas, Tom Johnson has always been a friend of union labor, indicated by his attitude toward his former employees, shortening the working hours of said employees from a working day of 15 hours at $1.75 per day to a day of 10 hours, at $2 per day, and whereas, by fair and impartial management of his line he compelled a decrease of hours and an increase of wages upon the lines of the other three compounds. Whereas, we have full confidence in his ability to obtain for the people of Cleveland a 3-cent fare, therefore be it resolved that we unanimously endorse Tom Johnson, our former employer, for mayor, and be it further resolved that we ask the cooperation and assistance of all union men in Cleveland in electing a friend of workingmen to the office of chief executive of our city. 37. On March 13, the Cleveland unions officially endorsed Johnson and his program. 38 On April 1, 1901, Johnson was elected mayor by a plurality of 6,033 votes over his Republican opponent. During the first of his 3 administrations, he threw open the city parks to the people, removing the "Keep off the grass" signs and establishing playgrounds and ball fields in them in the summer and skating rinks in the winter. Opened public bathhouses, dedicated the northwestern corner of the public square to free speech, educated the people in municipal problems by conducting regular discussions with them in a huge tent which was moved from place to place throughout the city, brought natural gas into Cleveland, thereby reducing the rates for gas, broke the street paving combine monopoly, introduced a more equitable tax system under which corporations would assume a larger share of the taxes, and took steps to introduce the 3-cent fare. Although his 3-cent fare program was enjoined in the courts and his tax victory over the public service corporations was wiped out in the state legislature, Johnson did more in less than 2 years to introduce progressive government in Cleveland than had been accomplished in the city's entire history up to that time. 39 inches There is scarcely a municipality in the country that does not need a Tom Johnson house cleaner, observed a labor paper. 40. So important was organized labor's support for Johnson that when he ran for re-election, the Republicans tried desperately to split the labor vote by nominating Saul Southimer, a leader of the cigar makers union. Number 17 and president of the United Trades and Labor Council, as its candidate for vice mayor. But the maneuver failed. At an emergency meeting of the council, Southimer was given an ultimatum, either to give up his office as United Trades and Labor Council president or get off the Republican ticket as candidate for vice mayor. The issue was then referred to his own union. Since the constitution of the central labor body specifically stated that no one but a regular delegate could hold office or take part in the deliberations of the organization, the local union met immediately to take action on the case. During the discussion, Southimer was called a flopper. He had once made speeches against the trusts and corporations, and by accepting the nomination on the Republican ticket, had shown a complete change of heart, had defied the union, and was no longer fit to represent the cigar makers in the United Trades and Labor Council. Refusing to bow to labor's demand that he resign, Southimer was withdrawn by the cigar makers local as its delegate to the United Trades and Labor Council. 41. Endorsed by the trade unions of Cleveland, Johnson was re-elected by a 5,985 plurality. 42 Directly after his re-election, Johnson began the campaign for a municipal electrical power system for Cleveland. Local 39 of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers headed the trade union committee established by the United Trades and Labor Council to further the campaign. Its members were especially active, circulating literature throughout the city exposing the efforts of the powerful public service corporations to bribe the councilmen to vote against the municipal electric lighting system. The victory for Johnson's program not only established the Cleveland Municipal Plant, but also forced the Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company to reduce its rates. 43. As opposition to his program became more and more pronounced in the state legislature, Johnson decided in 1903 to run for governor on the Democratic ticket. In the campaign, Johnson's attitude toward organized labor and trade union support for his program was made a key issue by the Republicans. They played up the fact that Peter Witt, a former molder appointed by Johnson as city clerk, had been blacklisted by the Foundry Employers Association as a dangerous radical, and that he had worked closely with Max Hayes, socialist leader of the Cleveland Typographical Union. Indeed, socialism was said to be the aim of the Johnson Trade Union Alliance in Cleveland. Mark Hanna, the Republican boss of the state and senator from Ohio, stumped the rural areas, charging Johnson and his allies with seeking to establish a socialist government in Ohio, and Johnson himself as being secretly the real head of the Socialist Party. Says Johnson is socialist. Read the headline in the Cleveland Plain Dealer of September 30, 1903. And the story went on, with all the emphasis at his command. Senator Hanna twice today publicly charged Mayor Tom Johnson with being the national leader of the Socialist Party of the United States. I beg of you, Hanna told an audience in Sandusky, to rise and kill the attempt to float the flag of socialism over Ohio. Later, in Lima, he declared, "Vote for the Tom Johnson socialistic ticket and you vote for the absolute destruction and ruin of your American institutions and for utter chaos in this country." It meant nothing that the socialist Cleveland Citizen, edited by Max Hayes, kept repeating regularly that Tom Johnson is not a socialist, and no socialist will charge him with being of that faith. Mr. Johnson is an individualist and defender of the competitive capitalist system. 44 The attacks had their effect, and with the public service corporations flooding the state with money to buy votes, Johnson's defeat was a foregone conclusion. On April 28, 1908, the Cleveland Plain Dealer banner headlined the news, Cleveland's entire street railway system now in control of the Municipal Traction Company. Within 10 days 3-cent fare will be put into effect. The day before, the city of Cleveland had taken over all the street railways, climaxing Johnson's battle to establish municipal ownership and the 3-cent fare. Cleveland is leading the world in the solution of municipal problems, wrote Lincoln Steffens. The victory that she has just won marks the greatest advance in municipal government in the United States. 45 It is therefore tragic that after this victory for municipal progress, the Johnson administration turned against the most important force that had helped to make it possible, organized labor, and in so doing paved the way for its defeat. Throughout Johnson's war to take over the Cleveland Electric Railway Company and make it part of a city-owned system operating on a 3-cent fare basis, the unions had supported him to the hilt. They assumed, therefore, that when the Municipal Traction Company took over the older company on that historic day, April 27, 1908, it would also take over the agreement Cleveland Electric had with Local 268 of the Amalgamated Association of Street and Railway Employees of America and respect the workers' seniority rights, especially since A. B. Du Pont, administrator of municipal traction, had so assured A. L. Benz, the Amalgamated Association's international vice president. 46 But having achieved his long-sought goal, Johnson appeared to have lost interest in the relations between the municipally owned corporation and the union. He left the entire matter in DuPont's hands, and the latter quickly proved himself to be viciously anti-union. He rejected the union's request for the continuation of the old agreement, which provided for an increase of 2 cents an hour in wages, free rides for employees, and strict observance of seniority rights. We will not recognize the old Cleveland Agreement, DuPont announced on April 30. The Municipal Traction Company and not the Cleveland Electric is employing the men. 47. Union men with 12 to 15 years seniority were discharged and replaced by younger men at much lower wages. The workers were required to pay their own fares, where Cleveland Electric had permitted its men to ride to and from work free of charge. 48. Cleveland's trade unions were furious. The United Trades and Labor Council reminded DuPont that without union support, municipal ownership and operation would never have come into existence, and that the Municipal Traction Company's anti-union practices were hardly the appropriate reward for organized labor's activity in its behalf. But DuPont refused to budge. Warned that the union streetcar workers would strike to enforce their former agreement, he replied casually, "I do not expect a strike. Even if one is called, not 10% of the men will respond." 49. Meeting at the United Trades and Labor Council's headquarters, the members of Local 268 debated the question of calling a strike against the Municipal Traction Company. The strike vote was overwhelmingly carried 1,452 to 128, but, concerned lest they embarrass the Johnson administration and the cause of municipal ownership, the workers decided to hold off strike action until the outcome of an appeal directly to Mayor Johnson. The union leaders then met with Johnson, who stated that he would see to it that the union was recognized and that the men obtained free rides. He then suggested that the strike leaders get together with DuPont to settle their differences. When the men replied that they could not even get to talk with DuPont, Johnson declared that he had hoped that he could be present at such a conference, but unfortunately he had to leave Cleveland to attend a convention. "We will all have lost our jobs before then," the men protested. Johnson then urged that the issues in dispute be submitted to a three-man arbitration board. He was certain the men's grievances could and would be settled, and concluded with the appeal, "Now at the beginning of such a bright era for Cleveland, let us not dispute over minor matters." 50. The men assured the mayor that the existence of their union and their seniority rights were hardly minor matters, but that they were prepared to accept his offer of arbitration. Streetcar men ready to arbitrate wage contract. Read the headline in the Cleveland Plain Dealer the next day, May 4, 1908. But the arbitration board never met. Johnson had left the city, and DuPont continued to discharge union conductors and motormen and replace them with non-union men at lower wages. On May 15, 1908, Local 268 voted again on the question of striking. With scarcely a dozen dissenting voices, the Plain Dealer reported, 300 angry streetcar men, members of the Old Cleveland Electric Union, voted for an immediate strike in two stormy meetings at United Trades and Labor Council headquarters. 51 the following morning, 1,350 conductors and motormen walked off their jobs. DuPont immediately introduced strikebreakers, imported from New York, into the battle, and the police escorted scabs to and from their jobs. The strikers fought back and bitter warfare raged in the streets of Cleveland between the strikers and the police. The United Trades and Labor Council unanimously endorsed the strike, praised the strikers, and condemned the Municipal Traction Company for having provoked the struggle. The council pointed out that the union had done everything possible to avoid the strike. It therefore went on record as endorsing the action of the Street Railway Union and call upon all union men and their sympathizers to refrain from riding on the cars of the Municipal Traction Company until a satisfactory settlement is arrived at. Walk 10 miles, if necessary, but walk, the Coruscant told all union men in the city. The Socialist Party of Cleveland supported the strikers, along with the trade union leaders. 52. Despite this support, the strike was smashed and the strikers, having been beaten into submission, applied to return to work. 1,200 of them were turned down by the Municipal Traction Company, and the few who were rehired lost their seniority. Local 268 was to all intents and purposes destroyed. Tom Johnson did nothing either to prevent the strike or halt DuPont's strike-breaking and union-busting role during and after the struggle. He defended himself then and later, and was similarly defended by many progressive reformers, by charging that the strike was instigated and financed by private public service corporations, particularly the financiers who controlled Cleveland Electric, for the sole purpose of discrediting municipal ownership. 54 Although it is true that the private corporations welcomed and encouraged the strike, the fact is that the battle grew out of the workers' legitimate grievances and Johnson's failure to prevent his commissioner from carrying through his anti-union policies. The Motorman and Conductor, official journal of the Amalgamated Association, denied that the corporations had financed the strike or that it had been called for the purpose of discrediting Johnson's street railway program. That the strike was financed by outside parties is absolutely false. It was financed by the treasury of the Amalgamated Association. Neither was it a fight against any 3-cent franchises. It was a fight against the Municipal Traction Company on account of the treatment it accorded to its employees. The union could not remain quiet, the journal continued, while its members were being discharged and persecuted in various ways, simply because these anti-labor practices were being perpetrated by a municipally owned company charging 3-cent fares. much as it sympathized with the objectives of removing public franchises from the control of private corporations and political bosses, and of providing working people with a reduced cost of transportation. The primary purpose of the association is to establish and maintain to its membership the best possible conditions of employment, and to protest against the loss of such conditions. 55. Johnson's conflict with organized labor was doubly tragic for the progressive cause in Cleveland. For one thing, he alienated all of the trade unions at a time when he needed wide support in order to realize his complete program. For another, his conduct led directly to the defeat of municipal operation of the street railways. The defeated strikers, hoping to get back their jobs if the Cleveland Railway regained operation of its lines, began circulating petitions for a referendum election to be held on the advisability of continuing city ownership of the street railways. This action was based on the Schmidt Act, passed by the Ohio legislature, which provided that if 15% of the voters signed petitions, a referendum had to be held on all franchise grants to public service corporations. Over 23,000 signatures were obtained for the referendum election. Held in October 1908, the election resulted in a defeat for the city-owned plan by the close vote of 38,249 to 37,644, a plurality of 605 out of 76,000 votes cast. 56. It was immediately pointed out that by antagonizing organized labor, Johnson had paved the way for the defeat of his most cherished project, for even though not all trade unionists were ready to reject the city-owned plan because of the anti-union policy pursued by the Municipal Traction Company, enough of them were affected to determine the outcome. 57. In the fall of 1909, Johnson was defeated for re-election as mayor. He left office on January 1910, a broken man, his health seriously impaired. Headied on April 10, 1911. At his funeral, the trade unions came out in full force to pay their respects. Except for his stand during the street railway strike of 1908, labor had regarded Tom Johnson as its friend. As one worker, waiting at Euclid Square for the funeral procession to pass, told a reporter for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, "No work today." "Well, I should say not. There is one thing that I insisted on doing, and that was coming down here and paying my respects to a man who had lived like a man, and who was my friend, although he never heard of me." 58 inches. It was he Johnson, wrote Eugene V. Debs, who set the masses to thinking about the wrongs of which they are the victims. 59. And they gave Johnson the backing that enabled him to make Cleveland the best governed city in America, and the necessary support during the 9 years' war with privilege, as Johnson described his administrations, to bring cheaper and better services to the community and expanded government activities to meet the needs of the common people. Labor and municipal ownership, Chicago. On April 8, 1906, 300 delegates assembled at Chicago's Brand Hall. They represented 53 labor unions and 8 civic societies identified with the labor movement or friendly to it, 2 Turner societies, 2 single tax leagues, and 4 municipal ownership leagues. An organization W-S formed under the name of the Chicago Progressive Alliance, and a 6-point platform was adopted. 1. An end to inequalities in taxation. 2. Municipal ownership of street railways. 3. A law requiring the suspension of business on primary and election days. 4. The nomination of all candidates for elective offices by direct primaries. 5. Initiative and referendum. And 6. Abolition of the injunction abuse. The first 2 demands were, at that time, of special importance to Chicago labor. 60. The struggle for tax reform in Chicago was led by the Federation of Teachers, an affiliate of the Chicago Federation of Labor. In 1902, Margaret Haley and Catherine Goggin of the Teachers Federation discovered that the reason there was not enough money to keep Chicago's schools open the entire year and pay the teachers was because the streetcar companies and other public service corporations were dodging taxes they were obligated to pay. Although these franchises were listed as worth millions on the stock market, they were assigned no value on the city's tax rolls. By means of circulars and public meetings, the Teachers Federation relentlessly pursued the issue. It attacked the Board of Equalization and forced it to tax the Chicago utilities corporations on the actual value of their franchises. At the same time, the Federation sued the companies for the taxes they had avoided paying. After a long battle, the suit was won in the face of fierce opposition from the city's business interests, from the taxing authorities, from the city government, and from the school board itself. This resulted in adding some $600,000 or $700,000 to the city's annual income, of which the schools received about $250,000. The Public, a progressive. Chicago Weekly noted. In the progress of the fight, the Chicago Teachers Federation came to be a representative body of acknowledged force in the community, and as its intelligence regarding despotic tendencies expanded, it came more and more. The Chicago Federation of Teachers also exposed the methods by which previous school boards had leased school lands to the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Daily News, thereby depriving the school fund of valuable income. Naturally, it earned the bitter enmity of these papers in the process. See Chicago School Lands, The Public, Vol. Ix, December 15, 1906, pp. 754-55. To be a local agency of democratic progress. What had at first seemed to its members to be arbitrary or corrupt school management, was revealed to them as a phase of the despotic tendencies, whether corrupt or not, in all public affairs. Against these tendencies this organization had ever set its face, and with such effect that the victories won in Chicago for municipalization of public utilities are directly traceable to its work. 61. While this last point may be something of an exaggeration, it is nevertheless true that the Federation of Teachers did play a significant role, along with other sections of organized labor, in the movement for municipal ownership. In Chicago, this movement was directed mainly at the traction companies and was spearheaded by the Public Ownership League, organized in 1902 with Clarence Darrow as chairman of its executive committee. In the autumn election of 1902, the League placed Darrow on the ballot as candidate for the lower house of the state legislature, running on a municipal ownership platform. Although at this point organized labor as a whole did not yet participate actively in the League, a number of trade unions helped circulate the petitions to run Darrow and helped to elect him to the legislature. Darrow's 11,000 votes were nearly double those of the other two successful candidates. Already popular with Chicago labor for his general activity in the progressive cause and for his legal defense of the trade unions since the days of the Pullman strike of 1894, Darrow's popularity rose considerably after the election when he helped to win an arbitration award for the workers of the Union Traction Company who were trying to organize into the AFL's Association of Street Railway Employees. The award ordered the company to dissolve its company union and granted the workers a substantial wage increase of more than $100 per year per man. Plans were immediately initiated to organize a Union Labor Party for the mayoralty elections scheduled for April 1903, with Darrow as candidate for mayor and with public ownership of public utilities as the platform. Darrow, however, refused to accept the nomination on the ground that it would split the progressive vote and guarantee the election of the Republican candidate. The Union Labor Party replaced him with another candidate, but its appeal to labor was seriously limited by the absence of a popular nominee. The bitterness in trade union circles over Darrow's abandonment of the Union Labor Party did not diminish labor's interest in his efforts in the state legislature to achieve immediate municipal ownership. The Chicago Federation of Labor sent petitions to the legislature in support of the Muller Bill, which Darrow was actively seeking to have passed. The bill provided, among other things, that any city could own and operate street railways if the voters in a referendum election approved the measure by a 3/5 majority. In May 1903, the bill passed the legislature and was signed by the governor. 62. It was to take another year before the Muller Act was voted on in Chicago. Meanwhile, organized labor intensified its activity in behalf of municipal ownership. On September 21, 1903, the Chicago Federation of Labor went on record in favor of EMO, immediate municipal ownership, and elected delegates to the EMO convention held in the city under the sponsorship of the Public Ownership League. Henry Demarest Lloyd, the noted Chicago reformer, welcomed the trade union delegates to the convention, declaring, "The presence of the representatives of organized labor in our midst will influence the traction situation in a decisive manner. It spells victory for the forces seeking municipal ownership." 63. However, not all union leaders in Chicago were pleased with the steps taken by the Chicago Federation of Labor in favor of immediate municipal ownership. Union racketeers like Skinny Madden of the Steamfitters Union adherents of the policy of not antagonizing big business by advocating radical programs, and union officials who were part of the Democratic machine and occupied soft jobs on the city payroll as building inspectors, bridge inspectors, or members of some bureau or other, mobilized their influence against municipal ownership. Although they had been unable to prevent the Chicago Federation of Labor from endorsing the program, they did succeed in stopping a number of the affiliated unions from lending it their support. 64. In November 1903, an issue arose which united nearly all of organized labor behind municipal ownership and sharply reduced the ability of the conservative union officials to disrupt activity for the program. On November 12, 2,200 employees of the Chicago City Railway, which operated all the lines on the South Side, quit work in a strike for union recognition and increased wages. Even before the strike began, strikebreakers had been imported from other cities and they were thrown in the moment the union motormen and conductors quit work. Protected by the police, the strikebreakers began to move the cars through the streets. The strikers fought back, stoning every car that moved. The union, through its representative, Clarence Darrow, offered to arbitrate, but the company refused. On November 22, 5,000 strike sympathizers paraded to a meeting at Tattersall's attended by 15,000 workers. With the entire executive committee of the Chicago Federation of Labor seated on the platform, along with representatives of most of the important unions, the meeting heard and cheered speeches supporting the strikers, denouncing attempts by the mayor and the city council to grant the company a new franchise, and calling for immediate municipal ownership. The Chicago Tribune reported on November 23, 1903, municipal ownership not in 20 years, but at once in the swift ousting of the Chicago City Railway from its possession of the streets was the doctrine spread through the ranks of 15,000 workingmen yesterday afternoon at Tattersall's. The meeting adopted a resolution demanding abandonment of all negotiations with the company for extension of its franchise and called upon the mayor and the city council to at once remove from the cars the police force and place them in the position that they are paid to fulfill, that of protecting the property and interests of all the citizens, instead of operating the streetcars of a law-breaking corporation, and to institute proceedings at once to take over the lines operated by this company and place them immediately under municipal ownership and operation. Ward clubs were to be organized by the Chicago trade unions to make sure that no franchises were given away and to advance the entire movement for immediate municipal ownership and operation. 65. 3 days later, the strike was settled, but the trade unions did not forget the demands voiced at the Great Mass meeting on November 22. The Chicago Federation of Labor intensified its campaign for immediate municipal ownership and joined with other groups in demanding that the city officials order a referendum on the issue. On April 5, 1904, by overwhelming majorities, the voters of Chicago approved the Muller Act and instructed the city not to grant any more franchises, but to proceed without delay to acquire ownership of the street railways. 66. A year later, in the mayoralty election of 1905, the Chicago Federation of Labor endorsed Edward F. Dunn, the Democratic candidate and a prominent advocate of city ownership and operation of the streetcar lines, and rallied trade union support behind his candidacy. Dunn was elected and began the battle to achieve the program of city ownership of the streetcar lines. It proved easier, however, to elect a municipal ownership mayor than to put the plan into operation against the combined opposition of a city council dominated by conservative businessmen, a state legislature controlled by conservative members from the rural districts, state and federal courts in the hands of former corporation lawyers, and behind them all, the titanic force of money and corruption, represented by the traction companies. Tyons poured huge sums into buying newspapers, party bosses, council members, state legislators, and even judges. Conservative reformers opposed to municipal ownership joined the alliance of Chicago's financial and business interests against Mayor Dunn and his allies. 67. In the face of this powerful coalition, Dunn was indecisive and confused. Despite this, however, the Chicago Federation of Labor endorsed him for re-election in 1907, stating that his clean, straightforward and consistent record in favor of municipal ownership merited labor's support. The Federation also condemned those members of the City Council who had sabotaged the municipal ownership program. 68. But the Democratic Party bosses deserted Dunn and made a deal to support the Republican candidate in order to inflict a death blow on municipal ownership. Dunn was defeated. If Chicago wants emo of streetcars or other things, Illinois will have to change its laws, its customs, its judges, observed the Chicago Daily Socialist. 69. Still, the long struggle for municipal ownership was not entirely in vain. Fearful of a possible resurgence of the movement, the private traction companies were compelled to improve the service on the streetcar lines. Under an agreement between the city and the private companies, the city was to receive 55% of the net earnings above 5% income on the valuation of their properties as fixed by a commission of experts. For the year ending February 1, 1908, the private companies paid the city more than $1.5 million as its share of their net earnings. 70. Moreover, a basic principle had been established. As one contemporary newspaper pointed out, under the persistent agitation for municipal ownership of Mayor Dunn and the progressive elements in Chicago, among whom organized labor was an essential force, the traction companies of the city have been forced to recognize that the public has some rights which public service corporations are bound to recognize. As a result of the agitation for municipal ownership, the traction companies themselves have been forced to make concessions which would have seemed incredible 10 years ago. If the people of Chicago can influence great corporations to recognize their rights, there is no reason why the people in other cities cannot compel similar corporations holding valuable franchises to like action. 71. Labor and municipal ownership, New York. Although Cleveland and Chicago were the storm centers in the nationwide agitation in American cities for municipal ownership, the battle in New York also attracted considerable attention. There the demand, for a municipal system of rapid transportation, was raised by the trade unions as early as 1896-72, but the issue did not attract mass support until almost a decade later. In the summer of 1904, the Municipal Ownership League of New York was formed, with the Central Federation of Labor as one of the founding bodies. Soon municipal ownership clubs were being set up in many of the assembly districts. Many of the clubs in Brooklyn were started by the Central Labor Union, and President Michael J. Flaherty reported on December 20, 1904. We have obtained several thousand signatures since the summer when we organized our first municipal ownership club. We have organized several districts, and a committee of 5 appointed by the Central Labor Union is still at work. Whenever we obtain 100 signatures in any one assembly district, we form an organization. 73. On December 18, 1904, a committee appointed by the Central Federated Union to present labor's position on municipal ownership recommended that the trade unions in New York go on record in favor of a municipal gas and lighting plant and municipal ownership and operation of the rapid transit system. The report, read by Alfred Belton of the Stereotypers Union, emphasized 3 reasons for this recommendation. First, the saving of dollars each month by humble families, who measure in dimes the difference between comparative comfort and positive privation. Second, the providing of facilities and opportunities for the working people to enjoy the advantages of distant high schools, colleges, museums, art galleries, menageries, parks and pleasure resorts, which are now practically denied to them through the greed of our transportation companies. Third, municipal ownership would dry up the most prolific fountains of legislative corruption, official bribery and debauchery of the franchise. It would be a staggering blow to the corporation-owned political machines, which are the mere agents of their corporate masters in nominating candidates and controlling legislation. 74. Within 2 months, a 4th reason was added. The union-busting role of August Belmont against the workers of the LNTER Borough Rapid Transit Company, the breaking of their strike, and the establishment of the open shop on the subway lines all served to intensify trade union support for municipal ownership of the rapid transit system. Possibly as you walk downtown from Harlem or are half suffocated in a trolley car because of the strike in the subway, read a leaflet distributed by the Central Federated Union, you will begin to realize some of the advantages of municipal ownership of public utilities. 75. In the spring of 1905, as the mayoralty election approached, the Municipal Ownership League decided to nominate an independent candidate against the candidates of the corporate interests which controlled both political parties. To no one's surprise, the nomination went to William Randolph Hearst. Hearst's New York American was practically the official organ of the Municipal Ownership League, and his employees were influential in many of the local municipal ownership clubs. Hearst was making an important contribution to the municipal ownership cause at this time by exposing and blocking various proposed gas and franchise grabs in the state legislature, by condemning Belmont's open shop policies on his subway lines, and by publicizing the municipal ownership movement when nearly every other paper was condemning it as an un-American assault on private property. 76 To be sure, Hearst was interested in municipal ownership, as in all issues he promoted, only to the extent that he could use it to increase circulation of his newspapers and promote his own political ambitions. If the movement also boosted the political prospects of any other figure who was active in it and thereby threatened Hearst's ambitions, he withdrew his support. In Chicago, for example, the Hearst press was indispensable in achieving the election of Mayor Dunn on a municipal ownership platform, but when Dunn loomed as a rival to Hearst's ambition to secure the Democratic presidential nomination, he stopped supporting the mayor in his battle against the powerful alliance that opposed his program, and his newspapers were silent when Dunn ran for re-election. Likewise, Hearst did little to help Tom Johnson in his struggle for municipal ownership in Cleveland because he regarded Johnson as a rival for the Democratic presidential nomination. In short, Hearst did a great deal to promote the municipal ownership cause when it coincided with his personal interests, and abandoned it whenever it conflicted with them. 77. Hearst ran for Congress in 1902 and was endorsed by many labor groups: the New York City letter carriers, the hatters, the printers, the metal workers, and the steamfitters. He was elected by a huge plurality and represented a working-class district in the House of Representatives. But while his newspaper continued to demand labor legislation, he did nothing in Congress to further this cause. Indeed, he rarely even occupied his seat in the House, a fact which convinced some observers that he was only interested in furthering his own interests. 78. But at the time of the 1905 mayoralty campaign in New York City, Man Publisher, they had a candidate who would wage an effective battle for the cause. Although the Central Federated Union did not formally endorse Hearst, many trade unions did and campaigned vigorously for his election. The campaign itself was a minor miracle. To all appearances, there was little prospect for victory for a hastily organized movement against the established political machines, well supplied with funds by the public service corporations. Yet so vigorous was the fight for municipal ownership, and so popular was the demand among the people that thousands, especially in the ranks of the working class, broke with Tammany and supported the Municipal Ownership League. When the votes were tabulated, the results showed that Hearst had been beaten by a margin of only 474 votes in a total vote of approximately 609,000. But on the basis of the best evidence available, it is clear that the election was stolen from Hearst by the Democratic machine. Thousands of Hearst ballots were thrown into the East River by Tammany henchmen and replaced by ballots marked for McClellan, the Democratic candidate. Election boxes were seen floating in the river. Efforts to obtain a legal hearing at which the Municipal Ownership League could present evidence of fraud in the election were unsuccessful. Irwin Y. Elowitz notes, Hearst had appealed to the lower middle class and the working class by his attacks on the entrenched wealth and power represented in the trusts and political machines, and by his promise to return government to the people. He had truly come, in the minds of a great mass of poor men, to stand for the rights of the poor, and they swung to his support with a vengeance. 80. After the mayoralty campaign of 1905, Hearst organized the Independent League of New York, with public ownership as its leading demand. While the organization was dominated by Hearst and his personal employees, it attracted progressives who were resentful of big business domination of the old parties and favored public ownership. At a state convention, the Independence League nominated Hearst for governor on a public ownership platform. Later, the Democratic Convention also nominated Hearst as its gubernatorial candidate to run against Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican nominee. At first, there was less labor support for Hearst in the gubernatorial campaign than there had been when he ran for mayor. 81 Indeed, there was, in addition to municipal ownership of street railways, Hearst promised an end to graft, 55-cent gas, new schools, and improvement in the pay and working conditions of city employees. He promised that he would resign if he could not keep his pledge. New York Times, November 3, 1905. So much pressure for an independent Labor Party that the Central Federated Union in New York City was forced to yield to the pressure and decided in favor of independent political action. On August 10, 1906, the Independent Labor Party was officially organized. As one labor leader pointed out, both the Republican and Democratic parties are more or less divided, and as far as this city is concerned, Labor has the best chance it has had of taking independent political action since the campaign of Henry George for mayor in 1886, B2. But as the campaign developed, more and more trade unionists came out for Hearst, and interest in the Independent Labor Party waned. In part this was due to the work of Hearst supporters who were active in getting resolutions passed by trade unions favoring his candidacy, BL. On September 29, 1906, Auguste Belmont, who was known as a Democrat, warned President Roosevelt that the labor vote would decide the election. Hearst appeals to the labor vote, and has a record with them which will ensure to him the support of a substantial portion of that element. Mr. Hughes has no record of this kind at all, and I am satisfied, and all to whom I have spoken on the subject agree with me that it is of great importance that Mr. Hughes should place himself in a favorable attitude toward labor. Belmont advised the president that he should have Hughes emphasize labor issues, such as slum housing, child labor, and sweatshops. Before Roosevelt relayed the suggestion to Hughes and attempted to implement it by securing labor support for the Republican campaign in New York. But he could find no labor leader of stature who would speak out in support of Hughes. I have been astounded and indeed alarmed to find that most of the men who I wanted to get hold of and send to you, Roosevelt wrote to Hughes, were against us. Even Republican labor leaders feared that to oppose Hearst would alienate them from their membership. The Republicans were reduced to inducing Richard Croker, abdicated boss of Tammany, to appeal to labor to vote against Hearst and public ownership. Croker wrote from Ireland, "I hope the workingmen's organizations will work together and not be misled by wild talk of trusts. The workingmen's organizations are themselves combines and trusts. I oppose trusts which would injure the public, but I am in favor of workingmen standing by their employers and encouraging capital to develop and extend labor. If Mr. Hearst wins and carries out his ideas, he will paralyze labor by forcing capitalists to invest in bonds and stocks instead of labor. 86. Although Hearst and the public ownership he espoused were defeated, 749,002 to 691,105, he carried every borough in New York City. Since Tammany, under the leadership of Charles F. Murphy, sabotaged his campaign, Hearst's ability to carry New York City so convincingly was clearly due primarily to the labor vote. 87. In both the mayoralty campaign of 1905 and the gubernatorial campaign of 1906, the issue of public ownership aroused more interest than it had in any previous election. In both campaigns, the labor movement supported Hearst, not because it regarded him as a consistent champion of its interests, but because the movements he led at this time gave expression to labor's own demand for public ownership of public utilities. Labor and municipal ownership. Conclusion. In Seattle, Buffalo, Detroit, and other cities, the trade unions were active in the campaign for municipal ownership of public utilities and were affiliated with the municipal ownership leagues in their communities. 88 in Los Angeles. Moreover, the trade unions were the leaders in the successful movement for municipal ownership. Early in 1906, union delegates and other interested individuals organized the Public Ownership Party on a platform which stressed, in addition to municipal ownership, direct legislation, free school books, increased educational facilities, and the 8-hour day at fair wages on public works. B9. Although the party was not successful in its 1906 campaign, it made the issue of municipal ownership so important in Los Angeles politics that it was to be raised again and again until it was finally achieved. Trade union activity for the demand was a crucial factor in the eventual outcome. The Electrical Workers Local, for example, was credited with being largely responsible for the establishment of municipal power and light, the largest municipally owned electrical system in the world. We spoke from soap boxes in the streets, the union declared after the final victory. We appointed a committee of our members to draw up resolutions asking the Street Railway Commission to appraise the portion of the Southern California Edison Company that was within the city limits. By dint of hard work, the city council, which was very favorable to us, managed to bring this about. 90. Paying tribute to organized labor's contribution to the general progressive impulse through its role in the municipal ownership movement, a New Jersey newspaper declared in April 1906. Involved in the municipal ownership issue is the transcendently important one of the abolition of privilege, a proposition which concerns the entire Nation. The machines composed of party leaders and the privileged interests have not developed from the nation down through the states and thus to the municipalities. The movement has progressed in just the opposite direction. Local leaders have become state bosses and then, in time, have come to wield a dangerous power through the House committees and the Senate as a whole. Since bossism has followed principally from the endeavor of the corporations to control municipal franchises, it is apparent that municipal ownership is more than a local issue. Hence it is worth noting at this time that the trade unions in many cities have made a significant contribution to the state and national progressive upheaval by their persistent work in the movement for municipal ownership. 91. Municipal ownership did not succeed in breaking the alliance between corrupt politicians and the powerful business interests. Nor did it strike at the main corporate power in America's economic and political life. Nevertheless, the movement revealed an awakening social awareness on the part of vast numbers of the population and compelled recognition of the principle that, as the Central Federation of New York put it, public utilities belong to the people, to be used by the people to accommodate the people and not to make money for the few. 92. Labor's progressive program. We have already seen enough of organized labor's contributions to conclude that it deserves an important place among the generators of the progressive movement and a central political role in its development. What did labor accomplish as a result of these contributions? To answer this question, we must first understand that the labor forces combined in their proposals both the demands common to the entire progressive movement and those specifically applicable to organized labor. This was illustrated as early as 1899 in the platform adopted by the trade unions of Ohio, which raised the demands for the direct primary, the initiative and referendum, public ownership of all public utilities and for union wages and hours on public work, abolition of the contract labor system, and work for the unemployed. This trend continued. Thus, in 1906, the Central Federated Union of New York drew up a platform which it submitted to the reform forces in the state. It included proposals for direct primaries, the initiative and referendum, direct nomination and election of all candidates, including United States senators, abolition of private ownership of public utilities and specific labor planks such as amendment of the Sherman Antitrust Act and abolition of government by injunction. 93. In the same year, the Chicago Progressive Alliance, organized by the trade unions of Chicago, demanded the direct primary, initiative and referendum, public ownership of public utilities, equalization of taxation and abolition of the abuse of the writ of injunction by certain corporations stocking horses, who have by various devices obtained place on the bench in federal and state courts. 94. Also in 1906, the Boston Progressive Alliance, organized by the trade unions in that city, adopted a declaration of principles which it determined to require all candidates for local office desiring labor's endorsement to sign. This called for public ownership of steam electric railroads, gas, electric light, and other public services, adoption of laws which would punish bribe takers and bribe givers alike, direct nomination of all candidates by the people, to supersede the present unfair and corrupt methods of nomination by cliques and party bosses, initiative, referendum, and recall, election of United States senators and state and county judges by the people and recognition of labor organizations in legitimate efforts to regulate wages, working hours and conditions surrounding the employment of wage earners, limitation on the use of injunctions in labor disputes and the enactment of legislation more clearly safeguarding the rights of members of labor organizations as to trial by jury, operation of all public works on union principles, and the equalizing of wages of both sexes in municipal and state employment when performing equal work. 95. Many of the demands raised by organized labor, in common with other reform groups, were achieved during the progressive period. By 1915, every state was using the direct primary in some form or other, while at least two-thirds had adopted it on a statewide basis. By 1912, 29 states had devised methods by which the voters could, in practice, choose United States senators, despite the wording of the federal Constitution. The initiative and referendum were accepted by 22 states between 1898 and 1918, while the recall spread to a dozen states before the close of the era. 96. In addition, the progressive period witnessed the institution in many cities of reduced street railway fares, more equalized taxation, better school facilities, public baths, playgrounds, municipal hospitals, medical and dental care, clinics, free meals for underprivileged school children, evening schools, free libraries, and free lectures, and in many states of workmen's compensation laws, protective legislation for women and child labor, and more effective factory inspection laws. 97. But for black workers, the benefits derived from these reforms meant very little. The major reforms of the progressive movement did not take place in the South, where most blacks were concentrated, and even in the North, progressive reformers showed little interest in the special problems facing blacks, such as job discrimination, inadequate housing and school facilities, etc. 98 * in the main, labor, both organized and unorganized, generally gained from the progressive programs. But organized labor expected more from the progressive movement, particularly support for its demands for the right to organize and strike and the outlawing of government by injunction. Unfortunately, in many states, the trade unionists were not represented in the leadership of the progressive movement, and the agrarian, middle class, and professional elements who held the leadership were not interested in advancing these specific labor demands. They were prepared to support labor's demands for the enactment of social welfare legislation, and they gave the labor movement invaluable assistance in securing such legislation in states which had never enacted such laws or had failed to enforce those which had been adopted. But there were clearly defined limits beyond which the progressives were not willing to go. This point is well illustrated by what happened in California. There the progressives learned from bitter experience that they could not afford to ignore the labor forces, and after at first concentrating on moral reform and remaining indifferent to labor and social reform, they began a campaign to include labor issues in their platforms and place labor men on their slates. 99 In 1910, Hiram Johnson was elected governor with the full support of the labor movement, led by the California State Federation of Labor. In previous legislatures, organized labor had failed to achieve its program of labor legislation, but after the election of the progressive governor, the California State Federation of Labor proposed 49 bills to the legislature. 39 of them were passed by the 1911 legislature, among which were many which had previously failed to obtain passage. These included the full crew law, which provided that railroad trains must be properly manned and carry a full crew for safe operation, a law which the Southern Pacific Railroad had theretofore repeatedly succeeded in defeating. Another measure which the outstanding exposé of exploitation of and discrimination against blacks in the South during the Progressive Era was the series of articles by Ray Stannard Baker, Following the Color Line, which appeared in McClure's magazine. In Vermont, an alliance of the State Federation of Labor and the Workingmen's Political League and progressive reformers secured the enactment of labor legislation for the first time in the state's history, particularly laws protecting woman and child labor through adequate factory inspection. Winston Allen Flint, The Progressive Movement in Vermont, Washington, D.C. 1941, page 107, for a somewhat different development in Connecticut, see Frederick M. Heath, Labor and the Progressive Movement in Connecticut, Labor History, Volume 12, Winter, 1971, pp. 52-67. Had up to that time been blocked by the railroad's lobbyists, provided that railroad employees should not remain on duty for a period of longer than 16 continuous hours. The paycheck law provided for regular payment of laborers in money or its equivalent. Under the old system, employers of unskilled labor had made a practice of issuing paychecks to their men that were redeemable at the pleasure of the employer if at all. The Sailors' Enticement Law, too, had been previously defeated, but was enacted by the 1911 legislature. It repealed the law which made it a misdemeanor for any person to entice a sailor to leave his ship. Child labor legislation, the Protection of Electrical Workers, an Employers' Liability Act, and an 8-hour law for women were among the other laws passed. Statutes dealing with such issues as workmen's compensation and the establishment of public exchanges were also enacted. In response to labor pressure, a compulsory arbitration bill was defeated. Later, inquiries were authorized into the treatment of working women and children and into the conditions of workers in migrant labor camps. 100. But defeated were bills that would legalize peaceful picketing and provide jury trials in contempt cases arising out of labor disputes, as well as 2 labor-endorsed anti-injunction measures. While the labor legislation of the Johnson administration, especially that of the first years, was viewed as representing important victories for organized labor in California, the entire record of the administration revealed that progressives set distinct limits on the concessions to the labor movement. Employers still retained the ability to weaken labor's right to organize and strike. Labor had succeeded in convincing the progressives that they would have to accord a new and important emphasis to the needs and problems of the urban working class. But many progressive reformers still viewed the trade union movement unsympathetically, lumping the unions with the trusts as twin evils in American society. In keeping with this outlook, they considered the closed shop an expression of the monopolistic power of labor which had to be fought as vigorously as the monopolistic power of the corporations. While the repercussions of the McNamara case undoubtedly moved a number of progressives to understand that the best way to combat tendencies toward violence in trade union circles was by demonstrating that government could meet the vital needs of the working class, others reacted to the same events by accepting the view that labor and violence were inseparable one from the other and that unionism had to be curbed. 101. AFL leadership and the progressive movement. Although the AFL had helped to initiate and further the demand for direct legislation, its leaders sought to separate this activity from the general progressive upheaval of the period. Until 1910, Gompers never even mentioned the progressive movement in connection with the demand for direct legislation. Finally, in the March 1910 issue of the American Federationist, he endorsed the spirit of democracy, emerging in many of the states in which the progressives were active and which was resulting in the initiative, referendum and direct nominations. 102. Actually, however, the AFL leadership showed little interest in the fundamental progressive doctrine that the powers of government must be expanded for the welfare of the people and that there should be much more extensive legislation than had been enacted up to that time. Government still occupied a minor role in the scheme of things as viewed by the AFL leaders, and they were primarily concerned with those governmental policies and actions which inhibited organization and minimized the economic power of the unions. Their horizon was limited largely to the factory gates, and they were not too concerned with following the workers beyond those gates into their homes and communities. They sought mainly to secure legislative action against governmental obstacles to organization and collective bargaining, emphasizing that once this was secured, the unions, and not the government, would be able to achieve higher wages, shorter hours of work, and better working conditions. 103. However, it was precisely in those areas that were most important to the AFL leadership that the progressive reformers did the least work and showed the least interest. To the AFL leadership, this came as no surprise because they had long since concluded that the agrarian and middle-class reformers either had no sympathy with organized labor or did not understand its problems. They could see little benefit to be derived by organized labor from a movement that was cool to the demands for the right to organize and for freedom from government by injunction. There were, of course, other reasons for the lack of enthusiasm toward progressivism in AFL headquarters. By exposing the control of both major parties by big business, the progressives strengthened the arguments of those labor elements who criticized the Federation's reliance on these very parties in political action. Moreover, the progressive movement advanced the whole principle of independent political action, since in those communities where neither of the major parties were prepared to incorporate progressive demands in their platforms, new parties appeared to advance the program. Golden Rule, Samuel M. Jones voiced the opinion of many progressives when he wrote to Gompers that there is no choice for the people between the two old parties. 104. Recognizing that organized labor's criticism of the reformers' attitude toward several of its key demands was justified, a number of leaders of the progressive movement emphasized that the more the labor forces sought to influence the growth of progressivism, the more they could assure that its program would include these issues. George L. Record, leader of the progressive forces in New Jersey, called on the AFL to enter the progressive fold, build a political alliance between organized labor and the reformers, and, by sheer strength of numbers, achieve a dominant influence in the movement. The toiler, who has the votes, should have the government, he declared in an appeal to the AFL in April 1908. 10 years of government by such men as you have in your labor bodies all over the country would bring about the millennium. Now get busy and organize your forces. Once this was done, he predicted, the unions could have everything they wanted politically. Tens. This was only one of many appeals directed to the AFL by those progressive leaders who understood the importance of achieving close and cordial relations between organized labor and the reformers. Samuel M. Jones wrote to Gompers, if the cause of human liberty, which is the cause, as I understand it, of organized labor, can be advanced by aiding the work we are doing in Ohio, I will be much gratified to have you openly endorse it and even help it along with a few speeches. 106 inches. It would be most helpful to us, Tom Johnson wrote to Gompers from Cleveland, if you would publicize what we are doing, and, if you can spare the time, come here to address meetings of unions in behalf of the cause. 107 from Mayor Dunn of Chicago, Gompers received an appeal urging him to address meetings being held to support the municipal ownership program. "We expect to have thousands of your members at these meetings," Dunn wrote, "and it will be most helpful to our effort to compel adherence to the will of the voters expressed at the last election in favor of municipalization of the streetcar system." 108. Gompers remained silent on these requests. But in a pamphlet written Gompers was suspicious of many reform organizations on the ground that they were sponsored by advocates of independent political action. He was cold to the American Association for Labor legislation, even though he served as a nominal vice president for a number of years, regarding it as made up of intellectual, third-party agitators. American Federationist, June, 1915, page 430. By a Toledo businessman to discredit Mayor Jones and public ownership in Ohio, Gompers underscored the following paragraph as representing his own thinking. "The full-grown working man is no baby, no ward of the state. What he wants is just laws and a fair show. That granted, he can take care of himself, and only in case of such disaster as no economic system can provide against, will he have occasion to ask alms of anybody. He needs not more government, but less." With this approach, Gompers indicated in his penciled comments in the margin next to the printed paragraph, "I am in full agreement." 109. In the summer of 1910, it will be remembered, the Labor Party of Arizona was organized to give effective expression to labor's demand that the constitution drawn up for that state would be a progressive document. Its program of 27 demands, as we have seen, represented one of the most advanced platforms of the entire progressive movement. In a memorandum to the AFL Executive Council, Secretary Frank Morrison condemned the Labor Party and its platform as representing a dangerous trend that had to be combated, the tendency to depend upon the government for all types of assistance, which if allowed to grow will sap the self-reliant spirit of the American working class. When you take into consideration the moving spirit of the new Labor Party or socialists, its program is not surprising. But certainly legitimate trade unionists should have nothing to do with this type of program. 110. Fortunately, the majority of legitimate American trade unionists in the cities and states were shaping such programs throughout the progressive era. Unlike the AFL leadership, they had reached the conclusion that the government must be freed from the influence of big business and that its powers must be extended to serve the social and economic needs of the people. They sought to effectuate these aims by participating actively in the progressive movement, both as initiators of numerous progressive demands and as a powerful force, together with other reform groups, in the campaign to reshape America in a progressive image. Actually, although there were socialist trade unionists at the convention which organized the Labor Party of Arizona, the majority were not socialists. Furthermore, the Socialist Party of Arizona nominated its own ticket for delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Arizona Republican, August 25-26, 1910. The national leadership of the Socialist Party not only did not support the Arizona Labor Party but tried to do everything possible to prevent its growth. Job Harriman was asked by the Socialist Party National Executive Committee to go to Arizona and help destroy the newly formed Labor Party there and thus avert the formation of a Labor Party as a rival to the Socialist Party. Minutes of the Weekly Bulletin, September 3, 1910.